Live from Washington, you're very welcome to this BBC News special coverage of Super Tuesday. Voters across 15 states are casting ballots for their choice for the Republican and Democratic presidential nominees. Tonight, Donald Trump is looking to extend his lead as the Republican frontrunner as Nikki Haley continues to make the case for why she's staying in the race. Hello, I'm Caitrionna Perry. We're live in Washington, D.C. You're very welcome. Well, it's one of the largest and most important days on the U.S. presidential primary calendar, Super Tuesday. Millions of voters across 15 states and one U.S. territory are casting ballots to make their choices for the Republican and Democratic presidential nominees. Both frontrunners, Republican former President Donald Trump and Democratic President Joe Biden, are hoping to extend their significant leads tonight, setting themselves up for a likely rematch this November. But Mr. Trump and President Biden are facing significant problems in their own parties as they gear up for an autumn campaign. Donald Trump's top Republican rival, former Governor Nikki Haley, won about a quarter of the GOP's primary vote last week in the critical battleground state of Michigan. Though she faces steep hurdles to become the party's nominee over Donald Trump, will her supporters rally around the former president if he's on top of the Republican ballot paper this autumn? Meanwhile, Joe Biden faces significant opposition from within the Democratic Party over his policies on Israel, which contributed to more than 100,000 voters refusing to vote for him and instead selecting uncommitted in the Michigan Democratic primary last week. The polls have just closed in Vermont and Virginia, and we can take a look now at a CBS exit poll of Virginia's Republican primary voters. That shows immigration topping the list of voters' most important issues, 37% picking that. It's followed by the economy, foreign policy and abortion. Now, we have the first projection of Super Tuesday. Our partners at CBS News here in the US project that President Biden will win the Democratic primary in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The win is important for Joe Biden, who needs to keep that state in November. CBS News also characterises the Virginia Republican primary race as leans Trump. We'll have more results from there and from Vermont as we get them. We'll bring them to you, of course. But let's talk about what's going on in Virginia. We can go live now to our correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue. He is at a polling station in Richmond, Virginia. Gary, the polls have just closed there. What's turnout been like? Have voters been enthusiastic about their candidates today?
Caitrionna, they have not. They've just shut the doors, as you said, here at this Presbyterian church in the southern part of Richmond. And certainly from the numbers that have come through this polling station in this little corner of the Commonwealth, there has been a real lack of enthusiasm. Something like just around 20 or just over 20% of the registered voters in this precinct bothered to turn out. And the polling staff here tell me that that's probably about half what they would normally expect on a primary day. So significant lack of enthusiasm. And it's interesting because when I spoke to some voters outside earlier on today, particularly Democrats, they were saying to me, look, we wish there was a different option. Age is a problem. Someone else said to me that Gaza was a drag on the ticket in terms of Joe Biden. So there was a real lack of sort of force behind those Democratic votes, even if they did tick Joe Biden's name. In terms of Donald Trump, a lot of people may have stayed away today because they think he already has it wrapped up. And of course, he is way ahead already of Nikki Haley in the delegate count and will go even further. If he gets more than 50% of the vote here in Virginia, then he sweeps all 48 delegates. And bear in mind, a lot of states voting today on Super Tuesday have that rule now, that if one candidate goes over 50%, they get all the delegates. So this could be a very big night for Donald Trump. It won't get him over the top mathematically, but it could be really sort of the end of the story in terms of Nikki Haley and what she does with her campaign going on.
Gary, we've seen in the exit polls voters picking immigration and economy as top issues of concern for them, notwithstanding what you said their voters have said about what they don't like. Have you heard any specific concerns around immigration, economy at the polling station where you've spent the day?
Yeah, well, the problem with the economy is that the figures are all pointing to something that's pretty good at the moment, but that's not being felt by the voters. And certainly any kind of improvement in the economy is not Joe Biden is not getting the credit for that on the Republican side, but Democrats also aren't feeling it. So I think the economy it's not surprising that's well up there. And of course, we know about immigration. We know that the border is going to be front and center in this general election come the autumn. And in some ways, Joe Biden has invited that issue on. We saw that split screen, didn't we, down at the border the other day with Donald Trump there as well. And Joe Biden trying to make a point about the Republicans not choosing to adopt that legislation when they had the opportunity, a number of wins they could have had, but rejecting it out of hand. So there is going to be battle joined on the question of the border and immigration. Economy was second, and some of these other perhaps more sort of social issues, if you like, may take a little bit of a step down the importance on the ballot.
OK, Gary, we'll be speaking to you later on in the night, but for the moment, Gary O'Donoghue in Virginia, thank you for that. Well, let's go live to California now. We can speak to Sumi Somaskanda, who is in Los Angeles. Sumi, you've been travelling around talking to voters in a couple of states. What have you heard?
Hey, Caitrionna, they really reflect what we just heard from Gary there and what you've seen in a lot of the polling that you've been referencing as well. There are two issues that voters are most concerned about. That is the economy and immigration. When it comes to the economy, they're talking to us a lot about the cost of living, things like the prices of grocery and gas, but also very much the cost of housing. We were in Phoenix a few days ago. We're here in Los Angeles. We were in San Diego as well. And the common complaint and common refrain that we're hearing from people is that housing is simply too expensive, whether people rent their homes or whether they're trying to buy a home. When it comes to immigration, the concern is about what is happening at the border across Texas, but of course Arizona and also right here in California, where we're seeing numbers tick up. We've seen immigration patterns shift away from Texas and towards California and Arizona. And there are concerns among the border communities that are struggling to absorb some of the people who are coming into the country, but also in some of the bigger cities that are struggling with resources to make sure that migrants who are arriving are taken care of and that they move on to their next destination. So those are certainly the two biggest issues. And I'll add, Caitrionna, we spoke to some young voters who stopped by, who were walking by us today here in Los Angeles, and quite a few of them said they're not voting. They're simply not motivated to vote. They feel like neither the candidates nor the parties are paying attention to any of the issues that matter to them.
And Sumi, what are, of those who are going to vote and who have been raising the issue of immigration, what are they looking for from the candidates? What kind of solutions do they want to see?
It really depends who you talk to, Caitrionna. So there are some, specifically in San Diego, for example, which is a more liberal city, who want to see more resources dedicated to helping migrants, to helping them be integrated into their city or to whatever city they are headed to. There are others, however, we spoke to a county supervisor who is a Republican who said the border needs to be controlled. I think what is interesting to note is that the states that we've been in have heavily Hispanic communities. These are communities and families who are really impacted by immigration. They are telling us that they know people who are undocumented. They have people in their families who have statuses where they are struggling to access resources or want to become citizens. So what they're clearly saying to us is something needs to be done, either a heavier hand on the Republican end, or when it comes to more left-leaning voters and Democrats, they want to see the president simply, the federal government rather, provide more resources to help migrants.
OK, Sumi, thanks for that. We'll talk to you a little bit later. Of course, the polls still open there in California. Well, the war in Ukraine is another hot-button issue here in Washington. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky stepped up his calls for the US Congress to provide more aid. Mr. Zelensky has gone as far as to say that the lack of Western support is directly responsible for Ukraine's losses on the battlefield. The US House of Representatives has been deadlocked for months on a $95 billion national security package that includes aid for Ukraine. That legislation cleared the US Senate relatively easily, but in the House, Republican Speaker Mike Johnson has resisted putting the bill to a vote until there's an agreement on more funding for protections at the southern border. Well, joining me live now is Ukrainian-American Congresswoman Victoria Spartz, a Republican from the 5th District of Illinois. Congresswoman, thanks so much for joining us. We've been hearing there that economy and immigration are two of the biggest issues for voters on this Super Tuesday. But given how extended the US is on many foreign policy fronts at the moment, do you think voters should be paying greater consideration to that area?
Well, actually, Illinois is a closed state, but we're much better than Illinois. Indiana is a much better conservative state. But just go to the issues you mentioned. I think there are a lot of domestic issues that have been neglected for a long time. And unfortunately, under this president, they got even worse. Now we have a serious situation on the border. We have a serious inflation. We have terrible energy policies. And our dependencies on countries like China have not been addressed. So I think people are upset. And you can see that turnouts are going to be high. And I think this is an issue that we have to deal with. We also need to do better on the foreign policy. And I think a lot of my colleagues, including Speaker Johnson's, were very clear. We are willing to provide lethal aid to Ukraine, which is actually should be as a loan we passed 2 years ago, Lend-Lease, which gives better oversight and accountability, and really better way for American people to support this more longer-term wars, which became unfortunately, but was engaged with by President Biden. So we have to think about that, but also we need to secure our borders. So I think we're going to be working on providing our own package, and we have to figure out how we can survive through this presidency.
On that package, including aid to Ukraine, Speaker Johnson has not indicated yet if he will or when he will bring that to the House floor for a vote. Do you have any information on that?
Well, listen, we need to go through our appropriation processes this week, but I think after we're done with these appropriations, this is going to be an important discussion for us to have. I think we've been busy, unfortunately, with a lot of our internal negotiations, which a lot of people, including me, are not very thrilled about, but I'm glad to see that our speaker is holding strong on the border security. So that's one of the issues that we'll be discussing, but I think it's going to happen soon.
President Zelensky would say that there really isn't much time, that they're running out of ammunition and that that's threatening the front lines in Ukraine. Can you put a time frame on when you think there might be agreement?
Well, listen, I think the issue of ammunition I raised almost 2 years ago, when we were discussing that we need to actually engage more production of ammunition and really get Ukraine should have gotten the economy and on the war mode. Russia did it, Ukraine didn't do it, Europe didn't do it, and we didn't do it. So we actually had to approve cluster munition, not for fun, because that was the only ammunition we really were able to provide in large quantities. So I think it's a different conversation. What are we going to do now and how we're going to restructure our industry and how we can have a more longer-term strategy. But I truly believe our strategy should be more decisive and not as long as it takes, but as fast as we can. And we need to figure out how Ukraine can win this war sooner than later.
Are you concerned about the message that it sends to US allies, Ukraine and others, that promises are made to support an ally but then not delivered upon, as is the case in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, listen, I think President Biden does a lot of promises, but unfortunately he failed the American people and promises what he did. He failed in Ukrainian people where the war is, and the American people with neglecting our internal domestic issues. That's why people are so frustrated, and that's we're going to have election and people are going to decide. But I think a lot of people, including on the Republican side, understand the importance of what the conflict is, but also understand that we need to have our strategy actions aligned, and we need to put pressure on Europe too. Europe does a lot of grandiose talk, but a lot of countries, and I exclude UK. UK has been much better and actually much more decisive on these issues than any other country in Europe. Baltics were very good at that, Poland, but the rest of the Europe leaves much to be desired.
And Congresswoman, national polls currently are putting Joe Biden and Donald Trump more or less neck and neck, looking ahead to the November polling date. Do you think is that reflective of the race so far?
Well, I think, and as the most important is really what is going to happen in the battleground states. And we can see in most battleground states, President Trump is leading significantly. He's leading with minority voters, he's leading with Hispanic voters, he's leading with young voters. So I think it's a very serious problem because I think people are now waking up of all mismanagement that happening under this administration. So I think he's a very strong case to win and start governing because our country truly needs governing, and he's the right person for these times.
Okay, we'll leave it there for the moment. Congresswoman Victoria Sparks from Indiana, thanks so much for joining us on BBC News. Well, our reporter Helena Humphrey has been pouring through the latest Super Tuesday results, so let's go over to her now at the touchscreen for the latest.
Caitrionna, polls have just closed in a couple of states. Before we start to comb through some of those results, I just want to bring our viewers up to date with some of the key numbers that we're watching here in the Results Hub throughout the course of the night, some numbers for them to also at home keep their eye on. So in order to clinch the nomination, remember, the all-important number is 1,215. Donald Trump and his campaign won't be getting there by the end of the evening, but they could be doing it in the next couple of weeks. Instead, the Trump campaign has said that they expect to pick up some 700 delegates plus if they're having a good night. So what we could be seeing is if Donald Trump manages to earn some 1,000 plus delegates tonight, he is having a good night. Now, for Nikki Haley to have a good night, we're talking about a far lower number, something around the 200 delegate plus mark. And there, of course, that's just a great illustration, isn't it, of that looming chasm between these two candidates and how it is very improbable that Nikki Haley instead will be able to catch up, particularly as we know that it's a winner-take-all system in a number of states. And that means, of course, that a candidate needs to get 50 plus 1 percentage point in order to take all of those delegates. And for Nikki Haley, the best performance that we've even seen so far, 43%, and that was in New Hampshire, of course, where she was doing well with independents and moderates. So let's take a look then at some of the results as they're coming in. The first two to close, as we know, Virginia and Vermont. Virginia, always a really interesting one to look at, of course, because you've got that proximity to Washington, D.C. See if, for example, there could be some weakness for Donald Trump when it comes to suburban areas. And what we can see if we just take a look here, Falls Church, if we just go over here to Arlington, Nikki Haley in front, 65% to Donald Trump's 32%. Not really a big surprise, I think it's fair to say, coming off the back of that sole primary victory for Nikki Haley in Washington, D.C. But if we just take a look over in Loudoun, for example, there we can see it's a little more close, 49% to 47% for Nikki Haley. Really early days, though. We're only talking about less than 2% of all precincts counted right now. Important to keep that in mind. Virginia, though, is never just the story of what happens around Washington, D.C. It's also about, as you move south, you tend to see more conservative votes playing out in the direction of Kentucky, Tennessee. If you just check in with areas like Washington, for example, you do see a vastly different result. 86% for Donald Trump. Nikki Haley there with 15%, only one of 20 precincts counted, however. If we move on to Vermont, we haven't got results in yet. They are going to be coming very shortly, but I do just want to point out what we'll be watching for. This is probably her best chance of success tonight. That's because, of course, you've got an open primary here. So you've got Liberal voters, for example, independents, moderates, who can show up and cast their vote. And if you look, for example, in Liberal areas like Chittenden, you're going to find Burlington, one of the most Liberal cities in the state, a similar case as well with Putney in Wyndham. So they're going to be key numbers to watch. If Nikki Haley here doesn't start to trend upwards of 50%, it's going to be very tough for her to earn more delegates. So far, just the results coming in from 2 states, another 13 to go.
Thanks for that, Helena. Well, let's get the views of our panel now. I'm joined by Rodney Davis, former Republican Congressman from Illinois, Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, and the BBC Special Correspondent, Catty Kay. Thanks all for being with us here. I'm going to go round the table quickly and get your opening thoughts on what you're looking for tonight, what you might expect to see. Catty, start with you.
I'm looking at turnout. And those reports from Virginia that turnout is low compared to 4 years ago are interesting. We know that this is an election where the country is not excited, particularly about either candidate. And what will that tell us about who's going to vote in November? I'm also looking to see, when we start digging into those exit polls, see what it tells us about each candidate's strengths and weaknesses. See what it tells us about people who, when they get to November, may or may not vote for their party's candidate. I think this election is going to be won or lost. It'll be a question of whether how many people from the Democratic Party Joe Biden loses, how many people from the Republican Party Donald Trump loses. And I think that tonight, with all of these millions of people voting, we'll start to get more of a picture of that.
Rodney, your thoughts?
Well, it's a 2-person race right now. And I really appreciated Helena's report. But to say that it would be a great night for Donald Trump if he picks up 1,000 delegates, and a great night for Nikki Haley if she picks up 1/5 of those, is just trying to find good news in this election for Nikki Haley. I think this race is over. What I'm going to be looking at tonight are the different congressional primaries and different down-ballot primaries in states like California, Alabama, and others that I think are going to determine who controls Congress next year.
Which will be so important for whoever is in the White House as well. Stephanie, what are you looking out for tonight?
You know, I think if I were running a campaign, this would be a roadmap for me on the areas in which I need to work on in the run-up to the general election. So if I am in the Trump world, I would be looking at, turnout, what Haley has been able to pick up, how much I have to do to consolidate my base. If I'm Biden, I'm looking at the crosstabs of the minority vote, the youth vote, and seeing how much work I have to do. But for him, it's a real narrow path that he has to walk, because doing something policy-wise to win back, say, Arab Americans could alienate Jewish Americans. And so this election, this turnout will really give you a path, like sort of your map for what you need to do going into the general for both elections.
That's always the challenge for the incumbent, isn't it? You are still the one doing the day job from here till polling day. So what does Joe Biden need to do to try and bring all those people together and get away from this apathy thing that we're hearing more and more about?
Well, I think they have to take this age issue head on. And they have been reluctant to do so. This administration seems to be defensive when they hear feedback that they don't like. There's inflation. Oh, it's transitory. There are economic price issues. Oh, but unemployment is great. They don't address the issue that the American people present to them. And right now, the American people are presenting to them that they have concerns about his age. And he started to do it in that comedy with Seth Meyers, where he was like, look, yeah, I'm old, but I'm experienced. The other guy's old too, and he's chaotic. They need to acknowledge what the American people are saying about him and turn it on its head and make it something that is a asset as opposed to a challenge.
Rodney, what about the Republicans? What do you need to do to those people who are voting for Nikki Haley, whoever they may be, bring them on board, get beyond the Donald Trump base?
Well, Donald Trump has to be more disciplined than he has been in the past. He's shown at times during this campaign that he can put forth a disciplined message. That's something that he's going to have to maintain throughout the rest of the election cycle, especially after he cements the nomination. But when it comes to President Biden can do all he wants to address the personal issues. But if he doesn't address the number one issue that keeps popping up every time we are sitting on this set with Republican voters and swing voters, especially the voters he wants to get that are Nikki Haley voters, it has got to be immigration. And we are not talking about fixing the ag worker visa program. We are talking about stopping the thousands and thousands of migrants per day coming through our southern border. He has yet to address it. And that is going to be the difference in swing states like Arizona, Georgia, and even states like Michigan.
But to be fair, it was the Republicans that rejected a bipartisan immigration deal. And so can he make that argument to the American people in a way that resonates when most of the American people aren't even paying attention to the elections yet? They're busy getting about their lives.
Sorry to interrupt you, Stephanie. I'm just told that we can project now in Virginia. We have a projected result anyway. Our CBS News partners there saying that Donald Trump has won Virginia, perhaps unsurprisingly. Just bring that news to our voters.
I grew up in Virginia. I actually grew up in southern Virginia, in very rural Virginia, and then I went to high school in northern Virginia, closer to Washington. So I'm pretty familiar with both sides of that state. I'm actually not surprised with this outcome just because the population and the broad swaths of the state aren't the Arlington County, the suburbs of Washington.
Do you think it could be properly in play in November?
I don't think it would be in play. And I also think that Abigail Spanberger is a phenomenal candidate for governor. And she is so smart and she runs a incredible campaign. She will be all over the state with a ground game that will have up ballot lift as well as down ballot lift.
Catty, I'll bring you back in there.
We'll get into Virginia in a second because there are some interesting data there which also reinforces what you're saying about it probably won't be in play. But I'm thinking back tonight to where we were 4 years ago and thinking back to this moment on Super Tuesday when Joe Biden had gone through this grueling initial primary process, done badly in Iowa, done badly in New Hampshire, consolidated turnout for him in South Carolina, and kind of went into Super Tuesday with the Democratic wind at his sails and a sense of excitement around that night. It's very rare to have a Super Tuesday, which some people now are calling Sleep-In Tuesday, because we kind of know the contours of this race, and we have done for a few weeks now. So we would be being disingenuous if we pretended tonight that this was full of surprises. Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee, barring, a lightning strike, I think. Wouldn't you agree that that's what we're looking at? And Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. But there is not much excitement. There's a lot of excitement for Donald Trump amongst the core of his supporters. Not so much when we start digging into some of these exit polls amongst other people, which I think is why we're seeing such low turnout.
And we will dig into all of that, of course of tonight, but we've got to leave it there for a quick moment and take a break. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello there. We could see more sunshine around for Wednesday than what we had on Tuesday, particularly across eastern areas. So I think a brighter afternoon to come, but there will be some scattered showers around, especially across England and Wales. And winds will generally stay quite light. We'll have high pressure anchored over Scandinavia, low pressure out in the Atlantic, trying to push this weather front ever closer towards our shores. But it could reach the West Country as we move through the latter part of this morning. Elsewhere, we're starting off with a lot of cloud across the east of the country. That will tend to melt away, though it stays cloudy for eastern Scotland, north east England. Some sunshine for East Anglia and the south east. A few showers into the afternoon, East Wales and the Midlands. And temperature-wise, up to around 10, 11 degrees, single digits along North Sea coast where we have the cloud and the breeze. Now, as we head through Wednesday night, it looks like it stays dry for many. The showers fade away. Start to see some cloud rolling into central and eastern areas. So where we have the cloud, more of a breeze, and temperatures 2 to 5 degrees under clearer skies further north and west. Then there could be a touch of frost. For Thursday then, we have low pressure anchored out towards the west, the southwest, that area of high pressure over Scandinavia, just edging a bit further westward, so influencing our weather more. Could start to see east-southeasterly wind picking up further though, so quite a breezy day to come. Plenty of sunshine around away from the east coast, and there will be some afternoon showers again, particularly England and Wales. Probably the best of the sunshine, western Scotland into Northern Ireland, western Wales. Top temperatures again, 11, maybe 12 degrees. Into Friday, you see more isobars on the charts. It's going to be windier, a strong east-southeasterly wind. That'll take the edge off the temperatures, pushing some cloud to northern and eastern areas, particularly the northern half of the country. England and Wales could, at this stage, see quite a bit of sunshine, but there'll always be showers loitering close to the southwest. And a windy day to come for all. Gusty winds, particularly windy across the south and the east, thanks to that southeasterly wind. So chillier along eastern coastal areas, up to around 11 or 12 further west. Into the weekend, low pressure loiters to the southwest of the country, trying to push its way northward. So we'll introduce further showers or even longer spells of rain to southern and western areas. We could start to see a few showers developing further north and east as well. It will remain quite windy with our wind coming in from the east or the southeast. That's it from me. Take care.
What does it take to become a top opera star like tenor Jonas Kaufmann, Welsh bass baritone Sabryn Terfel, and Greek-American soprano Maria Callas? I'm on a mission to find out how opera is trying to attract new audiences and reinvent itself.
I think music has the power to change the world.
Take me to the opera. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Free speech is meaningless unless you allow people you don't like to say things you don't like.
After winning, the people were so proud and it was so intense.
Сказав моїй дружині, треба збиратись, треба піднімати дітей. Почалась війна.
I never thought I was going to be a famous movie person.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC. This program asks plain questions with the help of the unrivaled range of BBC journalists right across the world. And gathered here in this building, I'll also draw on my time reporting on global conflict. Frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to, meaning our analysis is unbiased with absolutely no spin.
Unspun World. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Live from Washington, this is BBC News special coverage of Super Tuesday. The first returns from Super Tuesday voting are pouring in. President Biden and former President Donald Trump are projected to win Virginia as 13 states continue to cast their ballot. Hello, I'm Caitrionna Perry, live in Washington. You're very welcome back to our live coverage of the biggest day of the US primary elections, usually anyway, Super Tuesday. Voting is currently underway in 12 states in what is a crucial moment for the overwhelming frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination, Donald Trump, who our US partners at CBS project has won his first state of the night, Virginia. 865 Republican delegates are at stake in tonight's contests. To clinch the nomination, a candidate needs to secure 1,215 delegates in the Republican Party. Well, our partners at CBS News also project that former President Trump will win the Republican primary in the state of North Carolina as well. And we also have a CBS projection in the Democratic primary there as well. President Biden will win in the state of North Carolina. That again coming to us from our partners here in the US, CBS. Well, let's go live now to Gary O'Donoghue, our correspondent. He's at a polling station in Richmond, Virginia. And we can speak to Gary now. He's been at that polling station all day talking to voters coming and going. And Gary, the results, I mean, not particularly in jeopardy tonight, going as predicted so far.
Yeah, in fact, the registrar here has just phoned in the details of the results here. So you're going to see concrete results coming up on the website, on the Virginia Elections Board website in the coming minutes. And what's happened in our little precinct here is that actually Nikki Haley beat Donald Trump by 303 votes to 101. So a pretty healthy showing. And I think it's an indication, it's a pretty democratic area, it's an indication there's been a fair amount of crossover voting here. Bear in mind, in Virginia, there is no party registration, so you can show up, as long as you're a registered voter, you can show up and take part in either primary. And certainly Democrats we spoke to outside here today said that they'd thought about doing it, and they knew people who had done that, and that most of them were doing it in order to vote for Nikki Haley. So this little corner is a little bit different to the general picture in the Commonwealth, where Donald Trump looks to have a pretty big victory. And if he gets over that 50% mark, Caitrionna, of course, he'll get all 48 delegates from the state, as some of the rules across the country are reflected in that particular arrangement. But yeah, an interesting day. And I think, you know, in some ways the turnout here has been pretty depressed. Around about 20% of registered voters in this little precinct came out today, and the officials here tell me that that's pretty bad, even for a primary.
And Gary, that's going to be a challenge, isn't it, across the year, particularly with the results being defined and determined as early as they have been. It makes for a very long general election campaign. It'll be a challenge to keep voters interested in it.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we already know that 7 out of 10 voters don't want this match-up all over again. And in some ways, that turnout issue will continue, because it's the same two options on the ballot. And so there you will get into a battle over turnout, and it being a turnout election, as well as being the computations you have to do in those key swing states, the blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then those other two big battlegrounds of Arizona and Georgia. So this is going to be a turnout election mixed together with that question of those independent swing voters in those really tight states. Not forgetting, of course, North Carolina. I mean, Virginia, Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points last time around. So I don't think, despite what Donald Trump might say, Virginia is necessarily in play for him. But North Carolina is very tight. It's about a point, 1.3 percentage point difference there. Joe Biden, is snapping at the heels of Donald Trump on that one. So I think that will be a concern if there's a turnout issue for the former president.
All right, Gary, thanks for that. We'll chat to you later in the night. But for now, Gary Donahue in Richmond, Virginia, thanks for that. Well, one issue that is sure to be a big factor come November, particularly for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, is Israel and the situation in Gaza. There's been growing pressure, particularly coming from the left of his party, on Joe Biden to do more to pressurise Israel to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza and to provide more aid to the citizens there. President Biden has been raising those concerns. Today, he warned to Israel that there are no excuses for not allowing more aid into Gaza. The World Food Programme says the Israeli Defence Force has thwarted its first attempt in 2 weeks to bring food supplies into northern Gaza, turning back a convoy of 14 trucks. President Biden's team has also been trying new diplomatic routes to try and improve the situation in Gaza. Benny Gantz, a key Israeli opposition figure, has been in Washington this week, meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Of course, he is a member of the War Cabinet in Israel. Qatar's Prime Minister was also in Washington to discuss ongoing efforts to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas and to establish a humanitarian pause in the conflict. But ceasefire talks remain at a standstill. Israel did not send a delegation to Cairo for this current round of ceasefire talks. And every day that negotiators fail to reach an agreement is another day that people in Gaza are dying and another day that hostages remain captive. It's now 150 days since those October 7th attacks by Hamas. Well, our panel is still with us here. Catty, I might go to you first on that issue of Israel and Gaza and Joe Biden's handling of the Middle East. We already saw it kind of writ large in Michigan last week with those uncommitted voters, but how big of an issue is it going to be for him?
Look, we saw it in Michigan, which is a critical state in the November election because it's one of the few swing states. There are, 5 or 6 American states that are actually going to decide this election, and Michigan is one of those. It was won by about 100,000 votes. If you have 100,000 Democrats actually staying home, that could make a difference. Now, it's not expected that all of those people who voted uncommitted, and there's a history of these uncommitted votes in Michigan, will necessarily stay home. But you have a lot of, and I'm hearing it from Democratic Congress people who represent those districts, you have a lot of Arab Americans in those districts, people who have family in Gaza who have lost not just 1, 2, 3, but up to 30 or 40 family members. They're not going to forget. The White House is hoping that younger voters will come back to the Democratic Party. They feel more confident about that they'll be able to, that there is a pattern in previous elections of younger voters being apathetic and then voting Democratic later on in the campaign. I think those Arab American voters who have lost family members, grief goes in concentric circles. When it's closer to you, you feel it more acutely. They're not going to forget by November. They're not going to forget the Biden administration's policies or inability to stop the Israelis attacking Gazan civilians in the way that they have, and I think that's going to be problematic for them. We saw it with Jill Biden the other day. She was at an event and she got heckled. This is happening to Democrats.
Stephanie?
But, you can't forget that there's another population of Americans who never forget, right? And that is Jewish Americans. I live in Florida. I represented a district that was heavily populated by Jewish Americans. And for years, they had been saying to me, we're not really comfortable with where your far left is going on Israel. And I can't tell you the number of people who would say to me, I've been a lifelong Democrat, but I'm also a Jewish American. And if your party continues to follow this path, I can't come with you. And so as much attention as that is going to the very vocal Arab Americans, the Jewish Americans are watching what President Biden does. It is a real tightrope that he has to walk on alienating either one of these bases. And it's really a tough situation. And to be clear, the people who are protesting him, what would they rather? Would they rather a president who had a Muslim ban and wouldn't have a policy on Israel that was much different from the Biden policy? But certainly, I couldn't imagine a Trump 2.0 doing any humanitarian airdrops.
Well, let's ask Rodney for his view on that. How would Donald Trump handle this situation, do you think?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals about what Donald Trump would or wouldn't do.
But it could be a very real situation for him in just a matter of months.
It could be a very real situation, and the sheer fact that Joe Biden is trying to have it both ways on this conflict is going to give Donald Trump even more of an ability to win a state like Michigan and to win enough electoral votes to get elected. Now, the Israeli-Gaza conflict is a huge issue for Democrats. It is a huge issue for Joe Biden. Just like I believe Republicans are wrongly on the other side of supporting Ukraine against Vladimir Putin, I look at these as equal. If you are a Republican against Ukraine and, in my opinion, for Putin being able to win this war, that is no different than a Democrat being for Hamas terrorists that live streamed the atrocities when they started a war. You know, forgive me, but I have a lot less compassion for a government and a citizenry who continues to support that government, who started a conflict. Let's make sure you release the hostages that you still have from that atrocious day that you live streamed on October 7th. Release the hostages, walk away from governing in Gaza, and then this conflict will end.
And I think what's reported, not really focused on, is that there are still American hostages. I mean, this took down the Carter administration, having American hostages in the hands of terrorist organizations. And yet I think broadly in America, we talk about the hostages, but we don't really identify that there are still half a dozen American hostages and aren't kind of dealing with that situation with the severity that usually Americans feel about Americans being held abroad.
It's just the same passion that the Palestinian Americans in Dearborn, Michigan have for a ceasefire in Gaza is the same passion that Israelis who lost loved ones or who know people who lost loved ones have. And this is a conundrum that I think is going to really impact Joe Biden.
Yeah, that's the point you were making, Stephanie. And on the issue, Katie, that Rodney raised there about Russia and Ukraine as well, I mean, that's quite a big issue for Republicans particularly. And we were speaking with the Congresswoman about it just a few moments ago. The inability so far of Congress to do anything about it, to send that extra money to Ukraine that's promised.
Yeah, I mean, I had an interesting conversation with the chairman of the Intelligence Committee just on Sunday, Mike Turner, who I know you've had on the program before, and he sounded pretty confident that they will manage to get this aid package passed. I mean, I don't know what you've heard as well, but that the Democrats have now said that they would support the Speaker of the House were Republicans who are opposed to the Ukraine aid to try and oust him, and that then paves the way for this to get through. Ukrainians, of course, and I spoke to the Ukrainian ambassador just recently, she said, we cannot get this fast enough. We see what it's doing, not having this American aid. I mean, we've seen the decline in support, particularly on the Republican side for supporting Ukraine. There has been some decline on the Democratic side too, but it's interesting that actually in the House of Representatives, it's one of the few areas where you have a majority of the House of Representatives who support this. Now you just need to find a way to be able to keep the Speaker in his job to bring this to the floor, and then I think the President will get a win on this one.
Yeah. You have the votes, but do you have the courage to put the vote on the floor?
Well, it's broader politics as well coming into it, isn't it, Rodney, in terms of it is an election year for everyone in the House and many in the Senate and the presidential level as well, that it's also intermingled. The difficulty is separating it out.
It really is, and you're right. It is a major issue. We're getting close to the election. There's going to be that self-preservation mode by those who are in the House and the Senate. But in the end, usually American elected officials do what is right. And
do you think there'll come a point, though, at which in this year where kind of the lame duck session comes into play and people just cease being interested in trying to bring any of these bills forward?
The lame duck session will happen after the election, but before the election, there will be a lot of electoral pressures. But I do believe that you will hopefully see an agreement where Ukrainian aid can pass, along with aid for Israel, to continue to give them the opportunities to get rid of Hamas and get rid of the terrorists that the world witnessed on October 7th.
We're seeing two very interesting kind of forces at play, I think, with both that have been revealed by the war in Israel and Gaza and by the war in Ukraine. You have a generation of Americans, younger Americans in both the Democratic and the Republican Party, but particularly the Republican Party on the Ukraine side, who are feeling more isolationist, who are not as interested in leading the world, who are not as interested in helping Europe defend itself, who don't see that as much of a priority anymore. And on the other side, polls are showing us that you've got a generation of younger Americans who aren't feeling as instinctively supportive of Israel as older Americans have been feeling. So it's a very interesting year in terms of America's role in the world. Are we looking after this election at an America that starts to pull back in a way that it hasn't done for the last 17 years?
And it's not just a young...
Sorry, Stephanie, just to interrupt for one moment, because it is Super Tuesday and we're keeping an eye out on results, even if we already know what they are to some extent. And we have an update to bring you now. Our partners at CBS News project that President Biden will win the Democratic primary in the state of Vermont.
Oh, thank goodness.
So, I mean, that was fairly well.
What I was going to say, too, though, is that it's not just young Americans who are looking more inward and a bit more nativist. It's the Republican Party. I mean, the presumptive nominee presented in a rally the prospect that he would encourage Russia to attack NATO allies. As if that was like a bone thug that he could, deploy to get money out of these European countries for NATO. And he was cheered for that comment. So it's not just young Americans who don't understand the importance of alliances and the importance of having, being a leader in a democratic world order. It's Americans more broadly, too.
Rodney, there would be a perception in foreign policy circles that if Donald Trump is re-elected, that NATO will be over in terms of American involvement there.
I don't think so. And look, I'm not one to stand up for Donald Trump on a regular basis, but I will say I think what he says sometimes gets misinterpreted. I can remember when Donald Trump was president, traveling overseas with Speaker McCarthy and others, and we talked about the need for countries to invest what their fair share should be to fund NATO. And you know what? When Donald Trump said do it, they did it. So why wouldn't he continue down that pathway? I think when you look at Donald Trump, if you look at Donald Trump 2.0, you can't not look at Donald Trump 1.0. And I think one of the most successful aspects of the entire Trump administration was his foreign policy. Look at the Abraham Accords. Look at what happened. Look at the fact that we didn't see major conflicts begin. I think that's one of his strengths, and it's a crazy way he gets there, but he ends up doing it. This is a president who, unlike other presidents, promised to move the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he did it. So I don't have as much concern about Donald Trump foreign policy-wise. I'm more concerned about what he does with government here in the United States.
Cathy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people that agree with the congressman that actually when it comes to China, particularly when it comes to NATO defense spending and encouraging European countries, pushing European countries to spend more than 2% of GDP on defense, that you can, and the Abraham Accords, although maybe in retrospect that needed to have a Palestinian component too. There are lots of things that you could point to that actually Donald Trump changed, that many people now, look, Joe Biden has continued Donald Trump's policies. So that is, and he'd never say it, but it's certainly endorsement from this president. It is more what is reflected in the decline in support for Ukraine that I think is interesting. That are we looking at a country, and how would that impact Donald Trump's presidency? Are we looking at a country that is saying, you know what? It is not America's role to be so supportive of Europe, to be engaged with Europe. One of the biggest differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is whether you believe in multilateral alliances. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump clearly doesn't. And I think that, that could shape the way we see the world, depending on who wins this election.
OK, well, we'll come back to that thought in just a moment. We projected North Carolina for Joe Biden and Donald Trump a little earlier, and it is a critical state come that general election in the autumn. Let's go to Helena Humphrey now, who is at the touchscreen, and she can tell us what we've been seeing there. Helena.
Caitrionna, we've only got about 1% of precincts counted already, but I just want to take you through the map so we can have a clearer idea of how Donald Trump appears to have done this. We can just take a look and update directly now because we've still got that data coming in. Right now, we're seeing Donald Trump taking some 59%. That is to Nikki Haley's 36 percentage points. But let's take a look at the key areas on the map then. So, for example, if you go here to Mecklenburg, this is where you're going to find the city of Charlotte. Urban areas, for example, more college-educated voters, for example. And here, Nikki Haley ahead with 56%, Donald Trump there with 41%. Really, for any hope of picking up anything, Nikki Haley needed to be doing well in this area. This was her best hope of the night. Nevertheless, it appears that Donald Trump still way out in front. Another area that was important for the Haley campaign, somewhere like Wake, Durham as well, because that's where you'll find the state capital of Raleigh. And you can see 16 percentage points in it for Nikki Haley right now. But of course, the overall picture right now across the state is it's trending far more red. If you take a look at areas that are more solidly conservative, we might expect to find that somewhere like New Hanover, where you're going to find Wilmington, 5 percentage points in it. Donald Trump there on 50%, Nikki Haley on 45%. But Caitrionna, you were just mentioning, of course, the importance of North Carolina emerging as we go in 8 months' time to this general election. And just keep in mind, in 2020, what we saw here was Donald Trump winning by 1 percentage point. And what we can see by this early stage with 3% of precincts counted is it appears that he is trending towards growing support in this key battleground state.
OK, Helena, thank you very much for that. Stephanie and Rodney, I saw when Helena was going through some of the counties there in North Carolina, you both were arching eyebrows about some of the very early results that we're seeing there.
Yeah, you know, I was looking at the blue dot that was on the western side, and I surmised that that must be Asheville, sort of a more urban area. And I think that's an interesting thing, is that with the Haley-Trump primary, you're really seeing the former president's weakness among urban voters, even Republican urban voters, as well as more educated voters. And so that's certainly something that he's going to have to work on.
The numbers are so small right now. It's just not an accurate reflection of what we could see in the general election. And keep in mind, I've been saying this because I experienced it myself from 2018 to 2020. Donald Trump has the ability to bring out a low propensity voter that only comes out when he is on the ballot, and they vote Republican up and down the ticket. You look at my district in central and southwestern Illinois, where I barely won in 2018, where CNN called me a loser and had to pull it back. Just had to remind him of that. And then you go to 2020 when Donald Trump was on the ballot, and I'm winning by 30,000 votes in the same district with the same opponent who was better funded. And that is something that I don't think a lot of pundits take into consideration. And it could have a tremendous impact on who controls the House and who wins these Senate races in the future.
Sorry, I'll come back to you in just 1 second, Cathy, because we do have on the line now Congresswoman Kathy Manning from North Carolina. She is the Democratic Congresswoman there, talking about who's going to be controlling the House come autumn. Congresswoman Kathy Manning, thanks indeed for joining us. Very early results coming out of your own state of North Carolina there. I don't know if you've heard any of that yourself, or you know how things are gone there, if there's anything you're kind of noticing in your home state of note there.
Unfortunately, the Republican-led General Assembly changed the rules so that none of the mail-in ballots could be counted until the polls closed at 7:30. So it will probably be a late night to see what the results are in North Carolina. This is also the first year that photo ID has been required for voters. So we may see some voter repression there. And of course, the extreme gerrymandering has been a bit discouraging to voters, particularly in the areas where the gerrymandering has prevented Democrats from getting a fair shake.
And talking about up and down the ballot there, Congresswoman, do you think is North Carolina going to be a battleground come November?
Absolutely. North Carolina is a true purple state. We have an evenly divided, we have about 33% registered Democrats, 33% independents, and 33%, actually slightly less, registered Republicans. So it is a purple state. And back in 2008, when President Obama won. He won by an average of 2 votes per precinct. That's how close it was.
If I know we're a long, long way off November now, but if you were to try and call it, like, what are you feeling? What's the sense around the state from the 3.5 years of Joe Biden and the 4 years of Donald Trump before that?
I think there's a lot of concern about some of the rights that have been rolled back because of the people that Donald Trump put on the Supreme Court. Abortion is a big issue among people in North Carolina. The recent Alabama IVF decision brought that the impact of that Roe versus Wade repeal back into people's minds. There's a lot that's going to happen between now and November, but I feel confident that Joe Biden could win North Carolina if we work hard enough to get the voters out. And
turnout is going to be a key, isn't it, Congresswoman? I mean, it's such a long general election campaign in many ways because there is no particular jeopardy left at this point of the primary season.
Turnout will be critical. And the nice thing about this primary, people will realize when they show up at the polls and they realize that they need their photo ID. This is a dry run for what we will see in November. By November, hopefully all the voters will know they needed voter ID and will be able to bring it with them to the polls so we can overcome that attempt at voter suppression.
Do you expect to see the issue of the Middle East, of Israel and Gaza being an issue there? We've just been talking about that. Obviously, we saw in Michigan last week a number of people picking uncommitted on the ballot paper. How is that an issue there in North Carolina?
North Carolina is a very different state from Michigan. It is more conservative. If you look at national polls, you see that the vast majority of Americans are with Israel in this fight. Of course, we want humanitarian aid to help the innocent civilians in Gaza, but people understand that this war was brought on by the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, the slaughter of more than 1,200 innocent people. And of course, people are well aware that there are hostages that Hamas is still holding, including Americans.
And on that point, which we've been discussing here with the panel of the hostages, also there are over 30,000 people that have been killed, according to the Hamas-led health ministry. There's 2 million displaced people. There's a humanitarian crisis going on. And we've heard a marked change in language from the president towards Prime Minister Netanyahu around the need for urgency around aid and so on. Do you think is the relationship moving into a slightly more awkward phase now?
I think that Joe Biden has always been clear that he stands with the state of Israel, but he also is clear that all life has value. And there are many people across the country who are concerned about what's happened to the innocent Palestinians because of the war that Hamas started. I think that we will continue to make greater efforts to make sure that there is humanitarian relief and hopefully we will have a deal, a temporary ceasefire or a pause in the fighting so that we can get the hostages back and start moving toward a resolution of this conflict.
Would you like to see a greater focus put on by the president on the American hostages that are still held in Gaza?
I think we'll see that at the State of the Union tomorrow night.
And speaking of the State of the Union, what more broadly are you expecting to hear from the president there? I mean, he gets to set out his stall, essentially, doesn't he, on Thursday?
Well, I think what we'll hear is all that has been accomplished in his administration. I think we will talk about all the infrastructure projects that are now underway, thanks to the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think we'll hear about all the private investment that is now taking place in chips and other manufacturing, thanks to the Chips and Science Act. I think we will hear about the relief provided to veterans because of our passage of the PACT Act. I think we'll hear about more violence prevention programs, attempts to prevent some of the gun violence that's taken place because of the Community Safety Act that we passed. There was so much done in the last Congress under Joe Biden's leadership, and I think we will hear about how all those important pieces of legislation are starting to bear fruit.
And how do you think the president is going to work to bring those voters back in? I mean, only a third of Americans are actually happy with his performance as president.
I think he will be out there talking to the American voter, and I think people will start to see the benefits of what has taken place as a result of all the legislation we passed. Look, we still have issues with inflation. We still have high housing costs. We still have high food costs. We will continue to work to do whatever we can to bring those costs down. I also think we have to look at how we brought down healthcare costs with capping insulin at $35 per month for seniors, and that has now trickled down to everybody who uses insulin. And we will start to see the negotiating of the government over other medications that was also made possible through legislation we passed last term. I think the president will do a great job getting out and talking to the American people about what has been accomplished and what more he has to do to get the job done.
Does he need to be a greater salesman for himself over the next few months? He doesn't get credit for a lot of what you've described there.
He does not get credit for everything that he has accomplished, and I am hopeful that he will be out there talking directly to the people and reminding everybody what has been accomplished, and also that he is someone who always puts people over politics, which is a contrast with his opponent.
Okay, Democratic Congresswoman Kathy Manning from North Carolina, thanks for joining us here on BBC News.
Thank you very much.
You are watching BBC News, and it's Super Tuesday here in the US. There are more polls closing throughout the night. Polls have closed in 5 states just now: Alabama, Maine, Massachusetts, Oklahoma and Tennessee. Voting is still underway in Arkansas, Colorado, Minnesota, Texas, California, Utah and Alaska. Tonight is also a crucial moment for former Governor Nikki Haley's campaign. She's hoping to slow down Donald Trump's momentum as the Republican frontrunner. Tuesday's contest is the US presidential primary's largest prize, with more than a third of the total delegates available, and they are expected to be awarded for both Republicans and Democrats. Well, let's go back over to Sumi Somaskanda in LA, California. Of course, still voting there. Sumi, what's the view like there? Turnout, any impact? We're hearing about low turnout in other parts of the country.
Yeah, so Caitrionna, polls are still open for another 3 hours here, and we're going to find out a bit more about turnout as the evening goes on. We have heard that Californians have been voting by mail, and they've started about a week ago as well. So that means that impacts, of course, the turnout at the physical polling locations today. We've been speaking to voters throughout the day who have been passing by our location here in Los Angeles, and a lot of what they're telling us reflects a lot of the issues you've been discussing with your panelists tonight. The economy, so cost of living, and immigration. These are the 2 top issues that are on voters' minds here in California and in some of the other states that we visited before coming here. And I think it really shows us, if you look at some of the exit polling data that has come through as well, that there is a broad dissatisfaction with the president, Joe Biden, particularly on these 2 issues. We spoke to some young voters who felt disaffected. They felt that they didn't want to vote because the parties they believe are not listening to them, and they're not inspired by either candidate in this election. So a lot of the topics and themes that we're hearing here reflect a lot of the results you're seeing in some of those states, Caitrionna, that have already been called.
Sumi, we've also been discussing the impact that Joe Biden's handling of the situation in the Middle East with Israel and with Gaza, the impact that that may have on voters. Is there a sense that that's an issue concerning voters in California?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. We did have the opportunity to speak to a few voters here today who said they are frustrated with the focus on foreign wars. So our producer Naomi spoke to one voter who said it's precisely this issue of spending money on the war in Ukraine that they see as a frustration. As for Israel-Gaza, that is a bigger issue for younger voters who are frustrated with the Biden administration's handling of the war, the Biden administration's support of Israel until now. But again, coming back to the main issues of the economy and immigration, when we asked about the engagement with Israel and also with the war in Ukraine, the topic always shifted back to how much money should be spent here in the U.S. instead. So that prism, the lens through which they're looking at the U.S.'s foreign policy, really comes back to how they feel it's impacting them here at home.
And Sumi, the other issue, of course, that's turning out in the exit polls, apart from the economy, abortion, or the economy, immigration and foreign policy, is abortion and the issue of reproductive rights. Is that something that's also being discussed there in California?
I found it remarkable that none of the voters we've spoken to until now have brought up abortion as an issue for them. Of course, it is an issue that we're seeing is something that is more prominent among women, and some of the younger women we spoke to today did not mention that at all. It is interesting to note that in Arizona, where we just were, we were speaking to Latino and Latina voters. Some members of that community are more traditional, more conservative. And one gentleman did say to us that it is something that will impact his vote as a Catholic, as a conservative Latino. But all in all, we did not hear the word abortion or reproductive rights anywhere along the campaign trail, or at least along the states that we had been visiting. And that is something that I think is quite remarkable, especially we know that not only President Biden and his campaign, but also the California governor, Gavin Newsom, has made that a central part of his campaigning for the president. So it doesn't seem that that is a main topic here now for voters just yet.
OK, we'll chat to you later in the night, Sumi. That's Sumi Somaskanda there in LA in California. Well, our reporter Helena Humphrey has been pouring through the latest Super Tuesday results at our touchscreen, and she can bring us up to date now. Helena, over to you.
Caitrionna, since we last spoke, so about an hour ago, Donald Trump picking up now some 69 delegates to stand at 345. Nikki Haley still sitting there with 43. But I want to just show you the updated results coming in from North Carolina, because here we can see right now Donald Trump taking 68%, Nikki Haley 28%. So that margin there is growing for Donald Trump. If we just move over now, Texas is just closing. We're starting to get some early data coming in. Of course, conservative, so we're expecting a strong showing for Donald Trump, but it'll be key to watch areas like El Paso, for example, close to the border with Mexico. How strong is the support there for Donald Trump, particularly when we know that Republican primary voters are concerned about issues like immigration, for example. If we just take a look at some of the areas we can see already going red, very early days, it has to be said, 73% for Donald Trump, Nikki Haley there with 19%. But we're going to be taking a look at areas like Dallas, for example, areas like Houston, for example, and they're going to start to give us an indication, for example, with urban voters and so on, the real strength of Donald Trump's support. And we're also waiting for Massachusetts. We can see some data is just coming in. So if we take a look, we can see in Bristol, Nikki Haley there with 49%, Donald Trump with 45%, very early days. But of course, again, this was an area where Nikki Haley, if she was going to perform better than the polls were suggesting, this might be it. We're also going to be watching areas like, for example, Essex, Middlesex, where we've got Cambridge, so those college-educated voters, and of course Boston, which you'll find in Suffolk as well. So still very early days, but we can see overall Nikki Haley there with 49%, Donald Trump taking 45%.
OK, Helena, thank you very much for that. Well, we can now go live to Democratic Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan of Virginia. She is a surrogate for the Biden campaign and joins us now. Congresswoman, thanks indeed for being with us here on BBC News. I suppose no particular jeopardy for Joe Biden tonight. He's expected to sweep the boards in all of the primaries. What's your view on what you've heard so far about the results? Very early days, of course, in terms of turnout and different other categories like that.
Well, I think the results are showing that the Democratic Party is uniting behind President Biden, while the Republican Party, while it seems to be coalescing around Trump, there's still a significant percentage of Republican voters who do not support the former president. And I think we are seeing Democrats coming out in a stronger position. And we are now ready to head towards the general election, a showdown again between Joe Biden moving forward to work for hardworking Americans and improve their lives, and against Donald Trump, who will be looking for revenge and retribution against his enemies.
And for Joe Biden, how much of a challenge is it for him to energize the electorate? There are concerns about low turnout, people raising issues about his age and his abilities.
Well, it's not surprising to see lower turnout when there's not really a contest in the Democratic primary right now. I think we are united behind the president. What we are seeing, though, is a lot of people who understand what's at stake in November. They understand that our reproductive freedom, our voting rights, the progress that we have made addressing climate change, the progress we have made building the economy that won't leave anyone behind as we recover from COVID, all of that is at stake. And frankly, our very democracy is at stake. And people see that, they understand that, and they will come out and vote in November for President Biden.
You mentioned the economy there, and that's one of the top issues that voters are mentioning in exit polls today and tonight as they've been leaving polling centres. And while Joe Biden has done much for the economy, people still have sort of affordability crisis, don't they? A cost of living crisis where they don't feel better off, and that's something they're raising at the polls.
Well, and I think part of that affordability crisis has been addressed and will continue to be addressed as we have seen things like the Inflation Reduction Act begin to be implemented. But the president and Democrats have begun to lower costs, and we need to continue working to do that. We're working to lower health care costs, the costs of prescription drugs, and making sure that, frankly, that CEOs who have gotten record profits pay their fair share, that the wealthy pay their fair share, and that we're providing tax relief for hardworking Americans.
On that point of reducing corporate fees, how quickly can something like that be put into action?
I think we will see how quickly, but pretty quickly. And I think we will make sure it gets implemented as soon as possible. And I applaud the president for his announcement that he is going to lower these credit card fees. He's working to address junk fees. There's still a lot more work to be done that we are looking forward to electing Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to finish that job.
A lot of the national polls, almost all of them, in fact, have Joe Biden and Donald Trump neck and neck, with the former president edging it on Joe Biden in many of those polls. What does the president need to do to coalesce voters, to bring them together and bring them along with him?
Well, you know, it's still early, and what he is doing and will continue to do, and frankly, the entire coalition will work to do, is to make sure that voters know what has been accomplished. He has accomplished in the first 3 years of his administration more than many presidents have in 2 terms. And so we need to make sure that we are touting the accomplishments, again, whether it is through the infrastructure investments, record investments in addressing climate change, working to lower costs, working to address and forgive student loan debt. I think the challenge we see this cycle, more than in any other cycle, is that voters get their information from a wider variety of sources. And so we need to make sure we are meeting voters where they are more aggressively than ever done before, whether that be on social media, whether that be in communities, on TV, online. We meet voters where they are to talk about what the Biden-Harris administration and House and Senate Democrats have done, and not just expect that they're going to know or see a TV commercial or see a speech on television and know. So we're going to be very aggressive. We've seen earlier investments, particularly in Black communication in the Black community, and now we're starting to see rolling out Women for Biden. We are going to make these investments in a wide variety of communication media to reach voters where they are. And when voters hear what the president and vice president have done and what they plan to continue to do, they're going to come out and vote.
And just one last question, Congresswoman. Your own state, Virginia, of course, one of those voting today, and Joe Biden carrying that. How do you expect Virginia to play out across the year? Do you think it'll be a battleground, or how do you see it going?
Well, I think Virginia will be a critically important state for the president's reelection, and his planned investment in the state will show that. Virginia really is a purple state. A lot of people assume that we're blue, but we are purple, and I think it is a microcosm of the country. And I do think the president is going to invest in the state. There are 2 members of the Biden-Harris Advisory Council, myself being one of them, who live in Virginia, who represent Virginia. And I think they're going to make sure they're not taking Virginia for granted.
Okay, Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan of Virginia, Biden campaign surrogate, thanks indeed for joining us. We will be hearing, of course, from the Trump campaign in the next hour. Well, on Monday, the US Supreme Court struck down efforts by individual states to disqualify Donald Trump from running for president. The unanimous ruling is specific to Colorado, but also overrides challenges brought in other states. In an unprecedented move, Colorado was the first state to bar Donald Trump from its Republican primary, arguing that he had incited the 2021 Capitol riot and that this violated an anti-insurrection clause in the US Constitution. However, the Supreme Court ruled that only Congress has the power to remove a presidential candidate from ballots. The three states that had blocked Trump from ballots were Colorado, Illinois and Maine. And I'm joined live now by Maine's Secretary of State, Democrat Shenna Bellows. She objected to Donald Trump's appearance on Maine's ballots before withdrawing that decision after Monday's Supreme Court ruling. Shenna Bellows, thanks indeed for joining us on BBC News. You obviously changed your mind after the ruling from the Supreme Court. Had you anticipated that decision?
Thank you for having me. Yes, of course. We prepared for any eventuality. Behind me, I'm in Bangor, Maine, and poll workers are taking down the polling site and tabulating the vote. There are representatives from both Republican and Democratic Party, and the votes for Mr. Trump will be counted.
Do you think, has your decision had any impact on voters there?
I think that we were very clear with voters that absent a disqualification decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, the votes would be counted. Now, overall, like in many states, turnout has been low. But that being said, voters knew what they needed to do, and their votes were counted this evening.
Will you be taking any further action?
We will not. We will follow the law and the Constitution, which is my obligation, and the oath I swore to do as Secretary of State.
And in terms of looking through the rest of the year and beyond November, then, are you concerned about any issues that may arise in terms of validating ballots and validating the outcome of the election?
I've been traveling across the state today, and I don't have any concerns. We've seen a safe, secure, and free primary election. I anticipate a successful election regardless of who is on the ballot and who the voters choose in November.
Okay. Shenna Bellows, thanks indeed for joining us on BBC News. Thanks for bringing us those thoughts. Our panel is still here with us. We have Rodney Davis, former Republican congressman from Illinois, Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic congresswoman from Florida, and the BBC's special correspondent, Catty Kay. Catty, a lot to digest there and everything we've heard over the last half an hour or so, but it seems to be in many states, it's very early days in the results, of course, but turnout is an issue.
Turnout does seem to be down, and it's interesting. We were having the conversation just in the last hour with Rodney about how when Donald Trump was on the ticket, it helped Republican turnout. And I was wondering whether he thinks it's going to be the same this time around, given that we're seeing these kind of low turnouts, or whether I just wonder whether Americans like reruns. I mean, we've had this campaign. The last time America had two people running against each other for the second time was back in 1956. It was Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. And there may just be less appetite on both sides. It could be that although Donald Trump in previous elections has driven up turnout, he's driven up turnout amongst supporters of his and amongst detractors of his. I mean, as people on the Trump campaign have told me, people either really love him or they really hate him. But that kind of drives up turnout on both sides. I just wonder whether it's going to drive up turnout again in November. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see whether this presages actually people are kind of like, seen this show already.
Is it a rerun or is it a sequel, though?
I think it's going to be a rerun, a sequel, and I think it's also going to be an extremely high turnout race. You look at 2016, you go into 2018, you had record-breaking midterm turnout. The 2020 election was the highest ever electoral turnout in our nation's history. When it becomes that binary choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that's not going to change that turnout model. We cannot use primary electoral turnout as a guide to what's going to happen in the general election. I remember I used to work for a member of Congress, and it was a district where we had much higher Democratic turnout in the primary than Republican turnout. And every single time the Democrat candidate would say, look here, I'm going to win the general election because I won the election for the Democrat vote by a higher margin than the Republican congressman did. And we went on to smoke those candidates every general election.
And we do have to point out as well the number of people voting in primaries today and the previous weeks. It is quite small, isn't it, compared to the population of the state?
And I think this is something for our international viewers to understand, is that while 7 out of 10 Americans don't want to see the rematch, most of them didn't get a say in who is the presumptive nominee of each party, because these primaries have been closed primaries, which means that if you're not registered as a Republican, you can, or a Democrat, you don't get to vote. And more Americans are registering as independents. In Florida, almost a third of our new registrants are registering as independents. And we have closed primaries, which means that their vote doesn't count in a primary. And so that means that what comes out of the primary doesn't necessarily reflect the will of the broader electorate.
And it's those independents that will swing the election.
Exactly.
They will be the ones that decide it.
Interrupt, we have some more results.
Oh, more results.
From Oklahoma. I know, on the edge of your seats, everyone. In Oklahoma, we can project, our CBS News partners are projecting that Donald Trump has won the Republican primary in Oklahoma. And then the Democratic primary in Oklahoma, Joe Biden has won that one.
Yeah. We should have a drinking game that every time, Donald Trump wins and Joe Biden wins, we have to... No,
I don't
that's just what college kids do. That is what my college kids do.
Make it light beer and not shots.
It would have to be, because
home kids. Yeah.
We're here for quite a bit.
I'm sure it's going on somewhere, though. We can check that out on various social media platforms later.
They can tweet us the word that causes the shot taking.
Here's what we
try to work them in. No, but I think that that's something that is really interesting about the dynamics of our American democracy, is that our primary system actually disenfranchises a significant number of the electorate, especially when you have both closed primaries where you can't vote unless you're registered, and winner takes all, right? And so that's why we're seeing Biden and Trump rack up numbers that are insurmountable to anybody who might challenge them.
It is very interesting, because what Stephanie brought up was really the difference between the American electoral system and what the rest of the world may be used to. And I want to address your last guest, because I think that's an issue that I believe other countries need to understand. You have Shenna Bellows, the Secretary of State of Maine. She's not even an elected official. She's an appointed Secretary of State. She has never administered a presidential election during her time as an appointed Secretary of State in the state of Maine. It is not something that happens in America on a regular basis, where you have an unelected official, because of 2 or 3 constituent complaints, determining that the leading presidential candidate in the nation for one party is not going to be eligible to be on your state's ballot. And then you saw a 9-0.
I suppose she didn't determine it because the Supreme Court.
Well, she determined it, and then the Supreme Court took up the Colorado case and then included my old home state of Illinois and also Maine in that decision, 9-0. But I do not want the viewers overseas to think that an unelected official like Shenna Bellows has the ability in the United States to determine who should run for president in their state or not. The Supreme Court laid down that decision today, but to me, individuals who support that action and who supported the action in Colorado and Illinois are no better than those individuals who said Mike Pence can determine how many electoral college votes get counted on January 6th.
We're not going to talk about specific individuals here in that way at this moment, but let's just stick with the legal issues that you're raising there, because of course that's looming over the race for president, or all those legal cases that Donald Trump is facing. Helena Humphrey has a breakdown now of those issues facing the former president and voters.
Donald Trump might be the front-runner among Republicans, but he does continue to face a number of legal challenges. Just to remind you, the former president is currently facing some 91 criminal charges against him. That's in 4 separate criminal cases. He's already faced 2 civil cases this year. Donald Trump, for his part, insists that this is all part of a witch hunt designed to stop him from running for the White House. The Department of Justice has said that that isn't the case. They've denied that. But what you will see is that it likely will have an impact on the campaign trail. It's already been having an impact. If you take a look here at the key Republican campaign dates and then Trump's court dates, you'll see how they directly intersect. So if we just take a look then at the beginning of the year, the E. Jean Carroll defamation case, Donald Trump ordered to pay over $83 million to the writer. Then, of course, we had caucus races, primary races, and then in February, the New York civil fraud trial and the verdict in which Donald Trump was ordered to pay over $350 million to the state of New York. And then Super Tuesday, where we are today. And then in around 3 weeks' time, this is certainly going to be a case to watch. We've got the first criminal case against Donald Trump moving forward with regards to hush money payments. And then the classified files trial after that in Florida, originally slated for May, pushed to July, could potentially be even later than that. But it does come very close to the Republican convention on the 15th of July when the nominee will be picked. And then, of course, the 5th of November, the day the eyes of the world will be on the United States, of course, the US presidential election. The question is, were Donald Trump to be convicted of any of these charges, do people think that it should impact his run for the White House? And in fact, if you ask Republican primary voters, this is according to a New York Times Siena poll from December, 62% say they don't think that it should have an impact. Yes, he should still be the nominee regardless of that. So all of that just going to show quite how unprecedented this US election is shaping up to be.
Okay, thanks, Helena. Well, the projections are coming thick and fast. We have another one now for you from our editorial partners here in the US, CBS News. It projects that former President Donald Trump will win the Republican primary in the state of Tennessee. And we can also tell you that in Tennessee, in the Democratic primary, that Joe Biden is projected to win that one as well. Caddy, I'll just get a quick last thought from you there, looking at the legal issues that Helena was outlining there. How big an impact is that going to be through the rest of the year?
Look, I mean, up until now, there's no doubt that the legal issues have helped Donald Trump. They've given him an opportunity to say to his supporters that he is the victim of a crooked justice system. There's no evidence of that, but he's been able to go out and say that. And the question going forward will be which of these trials, beyond the Stormy Daniels hush money trial, actually goes to court, if any of them. Somebody close to the Trump campaign has said to me they think that if the January the 6th trial does go ahead, that would actually be negative for Donald Trump, that it will remind people of January the 6th. But it may not do. So I think we don't know. I think it's hard. It's a little bit what we were saying earlier. What you learn in the primaries is not always what you're going to learn about the general election.
OK, we've plenty more to come. We're going to take a short break there. Caddy Kay, Rodney Davis and Stephanie Murphy are staying with us. Hopefully you will too. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello there. We could see more sunshine around for Wednesday than what we had on Tuesday, particularly across eastern areas. So I think a brighter afternoon to come, but there will be some scattered showers around, especially across England and Wales. And winds will generally stay quite light. We'll have high pressure anchored over Scandinavia, low pressure out in the Atlantic, trying to push this weather front ever closer towards our shores. But it could reach the West Country as we move through the latter part of this morning. Elsewhere, we're starting off with a lot of cloud across the east of the country. That will tend to melt away, though it stays cloudy for eastern Scotland, north east England. Some sunshine for East Anglia in the south east. A few showers into the afternoon, East Wales and the Midlands. And temperature-wise, up to around 10, 11 degrees, single digits along North Sea coast where we have the cloud and the breeze. Now, as we head through Wednesday night, it looks like it stays dry for many. The showers fade away. Start to see some cloud rolling into central and eastern areas. So where we have the cloud, more of a breeze, and temperatures 2 to 5 degrees under clearer skies further north and west. Then there could be a touch of frost. For Thursday then, we have low pressure anchored out towards the west, the southwest, that area of high pressure over Scandinavia, just edging a bit further westward, so influencing our weather more. Could start to see east-southeasterly wind picking up further though, so quite a breezy day to come. Plenty of sunshine around away from the east coast, and there will be some afternoon showers again, particularly England and Wales. Probably the best of the sunshine, western Scotland into Northern Ireland, western Wales. Top temperatures again, 11, maybe 12 degrees. Into Friday, you see more isobars on the charts. It's going to be windier, a strong strong east-southeasterly wind. That'll take the edge off the temperatures, pushing some cloud to northern and eastern areas, particularly the northern half of the country. England and Wales could, at this stage, see quite a bit of sunshine, but there'll always be showers loitering close to the southwest. And a windy day to come for all. Gusty winds, particularly windy across the south and the east, thanks to that southeasterly wind. So chillier along eastern coastal areas, up to around 11 or 12 further west. Into the weekend, low pressure loiters to the southwest of the country, trying to push its way northwards. So we'll introduce further showers or even longer spells of rain to southern and western areas. We could start to see a few showers developing further north and east as well. It will remain quite windy with our wind coming in from the east or the southeast. That's it from me. Take care.
مجبور هستی که به خاطر زنده ماندن خود ترکش کنی.
Behind every headline,
What was going through your mind?
I was positive that I was going to die.
This cold is killing us.
There is a human story.
These TikTokers accidentally found a bot.
There's real people behind these stories.
This is our world.
There are people here who've lost loved ones.
A series of documentary films that reveal the human drama at the heart of global events.
We literally took nothing at all.
Trying to save lives, we have to protect our people.
Everyone okay?
We know that the clock is ticking, but I choose to stay hopeful.
This isn't a movie, this isn't a game, this is real.
Our world. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
I want to talk to you about the politics of this. Did she not think she was going to get that question?
It's important to remember that this is a negotiation.
It's a good photo of.
I have an opportunity to create chaos.
There is always an email. We are so insignificant in this cosmos. Do you want some facts on baguettes? I'm just feeding you the stories. Maybe this is the context.
The Context, weeknights from 8 p.m. on BBC News and iPlayer.
Live from Washington, welcome to BBC News special coverage of Super Tuesday. Voters across the country are casting ballots for their choice of Republican and Democratic presidential nominees. Joe Biden and Donald Trump have both had several early wins. Hello, I'm Caitrionna Perry. You're very welcome to our special coverage of Super Tuesday. It's a big night on the election calendar with 15 states casting ballots. The polls have just closed in Arkansas, where a total of 40 Republican delegates are up for grabs tonight, and we already have a number of results. The front-runners, former President Donald Trump and the incumbent, President Joe Biden, have pulled off their first wins in Virginia, North Carolina, Oklahoma and Tennessee. That's all coming from our US partner CBS News projecting those victories. Joe Biden also projected to win in the state of Vermont. Well, we can go live now to Virginia, to Richmond. That's one of the states that was voting today, to Gary O'Donoghue. Polls closed there, of course. Gary, what can you tell us about what the voters in Virginia have decided?
Well, no surprise, really, I don't think. Although, Nikki Haley had some hopes here in Virginia. I don't think there was ever a chance of her winning here. But because of they have a strange system here where there's no party registration, that in a sense some of the uncertainty was left in the race. But as our CBS partners have said, that Donald Trump has won Virginia. We'll see what the margins are. If he can get over that 50% mark, he can take all the delegates, and that's a rule that is often replicated across the country. So he could win really very big tonight. And we're seeing some of these other wins replicated, as you said, North Carolina, Oklahoma, other places now. Vermont, you mentioned, there was one of those places where, it's a quirky kind of state. Nikki Haley may have done something there, but that doesn't look like that's going her way. So is it going to be a clean sweep across the 15 states tonight for Donald Trump? It's certainly not impossible.
And what kind of issues, Gary, were voters saying to you today was kind of motivating them to get out and vote, for those who did?
Well, I think it's what you'd expect. I mean, the enthusiasm, I have to tell you, was pretty low today, and that was reflected in the numbers at the polling station I was at, and also just talking to people outside. There was no excitement, I mean zero excitement about what was on offer. People used phrases like, we wish there were other options. People used phrases like, he's too old, when they were talking about Joe Biden. People have, mentioned this question of temperament when it comes to Donald Trump. This sort of lack of enthusiasm, which we know has been reflected in the polling elsewhere and nationally. 7 out of 10 voters not really fancying this 2020 matchup all over again in 2024. And given the results that we're starting to see tonight, we are going to get that, and therefore turnout, I think, is going to be a huge issue for both parties come November. And for the rest of us watching, it's going to be a very, very long campaign.
Indeed it will, but twists and turns all along the way, Gary, no doubt, which we will, of course, bring to the world here on BBC News. Gary O'Donoghue there in Richmond, Virginia. Thanks for talking to us. We'll chat to you later in the night. Well, let's leave Virginia and head across the country to Colorado, and our correspondent Emma Vardy is in Denver. Emma, we've been hearing there from Gary about a sort of lack of enthusiasm in the voters that he encountered today. Any more enthusiasm in Colorado?
Well, there is if you're a political or international studies student, like here at the University of Denver in Colorado. They're pretty well engaged, holding a watch party here. They've been having a bingo game. But if you're the average voter on the street, look, this Super Tuesday just doesn't have the kind of suspense and jeopardy that most American voters will be used to when it comes to a Super Tuesday. And that's because, of course, Joe Biden, almost certainly to be the Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump has been out in front ahead of his rivals for a long time. So really no suspense here tonight about what the overall outcome is highly likely to be. We are looking, though, for those numbers around the edges, which give us a few clues about how the parties are doing. Something that's been a talking point here in Colorado is that in the Democratic contest, well, there's been this protest vote against Joe Biden because voters have been given the option on the ballot here to go for a non-committed option if you're voting Democrat. And what that is this protest vote against Joe Biden pretty much because of people's annoyance about his handling of the Israel-Gaza war. So while it's not going to threaten him becoming the Democratic nominee, it certainly won't do that. It will put a dent in things for him, and it is creating some unwanted headlines at a time when the Democratic Party ideally would want to be united heading towards a general election to face Donald Trump.
We saw, Emma, in Michigan last week, very organised campaigns around that ticking the uncommitted box. Was it as organised in Colorado?
Yeah, it has been very organised. I mean, if you're a younger voter, people who are pretty progressive and they want to just show, look, there is another option to Joe Biden, or at least try to sort of urge the Democratic Party to consider something else against all odds, and that's why they want to go out and do this. I was speaking to a non-committed voter today and saying, well, look, isn't this just going to hurt your chances overall? Divided parties don't win elections. But he was saying, look, there's so many concerns from Democrats about Joe Biden over his age, over his perception, over whether over her second term for him, that they want to try to push the party in some way to consider another candidate. But that still looks pretty unlikely to become reality.
Of course, the big thing in Colorado has been, until yesterday when the Supreme Court ruled, was the uncertainty as to whether the former President Donald Trump would actually appear on the ballot paper at all. Has that played into how people cast their votes today, do you think?
That's right, there was this big question mark over whether Donald Trump would be allowed on the ballot at all. Colorado voters here brought a case through the courts to try to kick him off, but that was overturned by the Supreme Court, who said, no, he will be on the ballot after all. I think it wasn't a real big surprise to voters here, and actually voters on both sides said, well, to me last night when we were talking to people, well, we want Trump on the ballot, because even if you're not a Trump fan, even if you really despise Trump and you don't want to vote for him at all, people felt that by not having him on the ballot at all, and it wasn't a fair contest. So actually it was a pretty welcome all round that it would just be quite a straightforward decision here, and that he would be allowed on the ballot after all. But it did bring up a lot of debate over whether he had taken part in an insurrection and all the kind of legal battles behind that he is continuing to face.
And Emma, you're there at a university. There's been much concern in the Democratic side of things about young people turning away from Joe Biden. What's the view there of the students there? What's kind of concerning them or exciting them?
Well, look, my sense is that a lot of young Democratic voters would like to see a different candidate, and that's why turnout might be an issue around young people. They might still be committed Democrats, but say, look, I'm just not that enthused to go out and vote. And when you're in an election which is highly partisan, most people have already made up their minds whether they're voting Republican or Democrat. There's that small slither of people in the middle who might be genuine swing voters. In that situation, turnout is extremely important. So perhaps on the Democratic side, where you've got people who don't feel that enthusiastic about Joe Biden, that could affect turnout there. That could just give Trump the edge. That is what this election could come down to, not necessarily the people who go and vote, but how many people stay at home.
OK, well, we'll chat to you a little later in the night when the polls have closed there in Colorado. That's Emma Vardy in Denver, Colorado. Thanks, Emma. Well, as we've been discussing, the economy and specifically inflation is top of voters' minds tonight in 2024. A stronger than expected GDP and low unemployment have economists more optimistic than they were this time last year. But voters don't seem to share that same assessment. A recent poll from our US partner CBS News found that 65% of Americans remember the economy under former President Donald Trump as being good. Only 38% give President Biden's economy that stamp of approval. And that all comes as the economy grew 3.2% in the last quarter of 2023. And inflation has dropped significantly from the 40-year peak that it hit in June of 2022. It's now at around 3%. Well, let's discuss these economic issues now. We can speak with Bharat Ramamurthy, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council under the Biden administration, and Thomas Philipson, former Acting Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under the Trump administration. Thank you both for joining us. If we just stay with that issue of kind of sentiment and feeling and how people perceive the economy as doing under President Biden versus former President Donald Trump, why do you think there is that difference, Bharat?
I think the short answer is inflation. Obviously, President Biden, because he presided over a period of time when you had the global economy reopening from COVID and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which caused all sorts of disruptions in global markets, the United States suffered a period of high inflation just like every other country in the world. And I think that that has taken a toll on incumbents across the world, not just here in the United States. I think the good news is two things. Number one, because of the policy decisions that President Biden made, the U.S. has had a stronger economic recovery than almost every other country, and wages have actually outpaced inflation for many months in a row. And second of all, as inflation tends to recede over the last several months and continues on that trajectory towards the election, I think that those economic sentiment numbers will continue to improve.
And Thomas, why do you think it is that Donald Trump is getting a bump on those figures in this way?
Well, I think the Biden administration is sort of playing catch up. What we've seen in the last 2 quarters has been really good for America in terms of economic progress. However, they're catching up from a bad experience in the past. So it's like a soccer team that's down 3 goals in halftime, and now they scored a goal and they think they're winning. They're still on the losing team in the sense that real wages are down since he started. Consumer sentiment is down since he started. Stocks are performing horribly. They're setting nominal records, but in real terms, stocks are only up about 3% a year since he started. The COVID aspect of it should actually help him, because usually when you have a recession, what happens is that you bounce back much stronger. And that's what we saw in the last quarter of the Trump administration in 2020. We had 6% of GDP growth annualized, and real wages were going up rapidly. So saying that this is due to COVID is misleading, because usually when you have big downturns, you also have enormous upturns, which have not seen under the Biden administration.
But while the economy may be improving, people aren't necessarily feeling that in their paychecks, in their wallet, in how they can afford their grocery shopping at the end of the week, or their rent or their mortgage payments. Bharat, what could President Biden do to improve that?
Well, I want to take issue with that, because I think if you look at the data, wages have been outpacing inflation for several months now. And if you look at the trajectory of wages over time, real wages are actually up relative to the beginning of the pandemic. And wages are particularly up for lower income folks who have not gotten that kind of sustained wage growth in a long time.
But why do people report then feeling less well off?
Well, I think it's important that we distinguish between people self-reporting of their financial condition, which if you look at the survey data, tends to show that people feel pretty good about their own economic condition. But when asked about the national economy, they tend to have negative views. And I think that's in part because the coverage has been enormously about inflation. I think the real key is over the next several months, as inflation continues to decline and wages continue to go up, are those numbers going to shift in President Biden's direction? Because, and I think that everyone would have to admit this objectively, the United States has had the strongest recovery from COVID. And if you look at the recovery that the Trump administration was presiding over, you look at job growth in the 3 months before the Biden administration took over. If we had continued that pace, we wouldn't have recovered the jobs lost in COVID for several years. Instead, because of the Biden administration, we recovered those jobs in about a year and a half. So we've had an extraordinarily strong recovery, and folks in the UK and EU would probably gladly switch places with us.
Tomas, do you agree with that the US is a world leader on the recovery front from COVID?
I just don't think being least bad is a great way to justify your policies in some sense. A lot of European countries made the same mistake as the US in terms of an enormous debt being underfinanced, potentially by large monetization of that debt. Essentially, you can finance the new spending under COVID in 3 ways. Either you tax people now or you tax them later through having debt, or you basically monetize it and print new money essentially to finance the spending. All European, or not all, many European countries and the US went that to the extreme on basically debt finance with monetization, and that's why they all have inflation. That's not a good thing. And just because you're least bad is not really a good justification, in my view, for a policy.
And just to ask you both, one of the issues that we've heard from voters today is around housing and the price of housing and the difficulty that people have purchasing their own home. What do you expect to happen over the rest of the year between now and polling date? Fed rate rises may come. That situation may disprove or improve. What's your view? Bharat, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Number one, 65% of households are homeowners. So the fact that house prices have gone up in the last few years at a very rapid pace is actually a good thing for wealth building for a majority of the US population. Second of all, if you look at home ownership rates for younger Americans and for Black Americans, those are actually at record high levels, much higher than they were during the Trump administration. So despite some of these affordability challenges, people have been able to get into homes, in part, again, because we've seen a strong performance on wages and asset growth in the United States. I think you're likely to see 2, 3, 4 Fed cuts this year. That will help on the affordability front, as that will drive mortgage rates down even further.
Tomas, what's your view?
Yeah, my view is that about 85% of the bottom quarter of the income distribution rent, and they have seen enormous increases in their housing cost in terms of rents going up. They don't own a house, essentially. In general, these policies have been very regressive of the Biden administration, meaning the poor are giving up a larger share of their income for the government growth generated under the Biden administration. You see that in the inflation tax, which is just another tax. That is hitting poor a lot harder than the rich, because it's hitting items that the poor spend a lot on, such as housing, food, gas, etc. If you take the 1%ers, they spend nothing on gas. I mean, it's a trivial amount of money, but transportation for a poor family is about 15% of their budget, essentially. So the inflation has really hit the poor the hardest, and it's been a very regressive way, or a lot of regressive policies of the Biden administration, even though they claim that they're all about taxing the rich and helping the poor.
Okay, well, we are no doubt likely to see this issue played out over the next few months. We'll leave it there for the moment. Bharat Ramamurthy, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council under the Biden administration, and Tomas Philipson, former Acting Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under the Trump administration. Thank you both for joining us on BBC News tonight.
Thank you.
Well, we have another results projection to bring you now from our partners at CBS News. They project that President Biden will win the Democratic primary in the state of Massachusetts. Our panel is still with us here in studio. We have Rodney Davis, former Republican Congressman from Illinois, Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, and Caddy Kay, our special correspondent here at BBC News. We've just been talking about the economy, and it's come up with our correspondents as well through the night in terms of what voters are reporting, this issue of affordability, of housing. And Stephanie, we kind of touched on it earlier, that the economy is doing well under Joe Biden, but people don't necessarily feel that it is.
It's really an interesting situation that even the most recent polls show that people are starting to recognize the economy is getting better, yet they still remember that under Trump they were doing better off economically than they are with the Biden administration. And in almost all polls, it's almost double digits that voters trust Trump more than they do Biden on the economy. That is a steep hill to overcome before the general election, because when people roll to the polls, they vote based on pocketbook issues a lot of times. And unless the Biden campaign can kind of adjust this sentiment, they're going to be in real trouble in the fall.
How do they do that? How do they adjust that?
You know, I mean, it's hard because, as you said, the actual facts belie the way people feel about it.
Rodney, what do you think?
I think we have to see a cap on interest rates. Most Americans probably are not affected by what happens at the Fed when it comes to interest rates on homes, but it's something that affects them and it affects their view of what economic growth should look like. Stephanie is right. Most Americans felt they were better off under Trump. And in a rematch like this, that can have a tremendous impact. However, every single election year, the economy is always near the top or right under the top at number 2. It's something that people always recognize as the issue. But I think one key factor we have to take a look at is the number one issue is immigration and border security issues. That, I believe, affects people's viewpoint on the economy because they have angst. They're worried about America, they're worried about their country, and they're going to try to find things that are wrong rather than what's going right economically.
That's interesting how those two issues interplay, isn't it, Catty? Because unemployment is so low in this country at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable having this conversation when you think of it from a European perspective, right? In the United States, unemployment's below 4%, inflation is below 4%, GDP is doing well. It's the stubbornness, though, of grocery prices are still higher than they were, still taking up more of people's paychecks every month. The interest rates, if they came down, that would certainly help people who are paying mortgages in the country or on flexible mortgage rates. Actually, most people in America are on fixed mortgage rates, so it probably doesn't make that much difference. But it's in the sort of psyche.
A whole cadre of people who can't buy homes at the moment. I mean, the supply is very poor because people are holding on to those rates.
And when we spoke about young voters earlier, this is another issue that is affecting them. You know, I have kids who are renting here in Washington. It's incredibly expensive for people in their 20s to rent an apartment in this city. It's a lot. It takes a lot out of your paycheck. So people are very conscious about that, particularly young voters are conscious about that. I mean, the White House would say, look, they're starting to see numbers that show that consumer sentiment is picking up with where the actual numbers are. And to some extent, how people feel might be a lagging indicator. And that actually, now that we have had a few months of inflation coming down, if interest rate comes down further, then that consumer sentiment could pick up again. It's going to be a huge issue for the campaign.
And I think the Biden administration to date has undermined the voters' trust in them as it relates to the economy. So, because when we first started seeing inflation, they said, no, that's transitory inflation. Average Americans don't even know what that means. And then when people were complaining about cost of goods and prices, they said, well, but look at our employment numbers. Those are great. That means the economy is doing well. They talk to people in macroeconomic statistics instead of talking to people in their pain point. And
why is that? I mean,
because the administration is reflexively defensive when they hear anything that is critical. It's the same reason why when people talk about his age, they're like, oh, there's not an age problem here. I mean, you can't wish away what people are criticizing you for. You need to embrace it and address it head on. And because if you don't, they lose trust in what you're saying. And I think they've lost some trust as it relates to the economy.
Rodney, the Republicans will be hoping that the Biden administration doesn't change its approach, I suppose.
Well, just like people say Donald Trump doesn't change, the reaction to criticism coming toward the Biden administration has not changed from Biden officials and, frankly, the president himself.
Okay, well, we'll chat more about this in a moment. We have more results. Everyone on the edge of your seats for this one. Now we are going to Maine. We have projections there from our CBS partners. President Biden is projected to win the Democratic primary in the state of Maine. And no surprises, perhaps, with the Maine Republican primary either. CBS projecting that former President Donald Trump will win the Republican primary in the state of Maine. Well, let's whip over to our reporter, Helena Humphrey, who's at our results hub for us, and she can talk us through what we know so far. Helena.
All right, Caitrionna, let's take a look then at where we're standing when it comes to the delegates since the beginning of the evening then. Since the beginning of the evening, we're seeing Donald Trump. He's picking up about over 140 delegates so far. Contrast that to Nikki Haley, who's managed to pick up, well, 3 delegates. And just an interesting fact for you, if Nikki Haley and her campaign wanted to stop Donald Trump from being able to wrap up that nomination by the 12th of March when Georgia goes to the polls, she would be needing to pick up something like 97 delegates this evening alone. So you can see the scale of the task at hand. But let's take a look now where we're starting to see some of the results. So Oklahoma, 28% of all the precincts counted. But what is interesting in Oklahoma is in 2020, we saw a picture like this as well. It was only one of 2 US states, all of the counties going for Donald Trump. At the moment, we are seeing that trend continuing, although still early days, it has to be pointed out. Let's just update the latest results that we've got coming in. Donald Trump, as you can see there, 82%, Nikki Haley 14%. Going into this, looking at polling, we were seeing Donald Trump taking something like 77% of the votes, although not all of those votes counted. Let's check in again with Texas, because Texas is the second biggest prize of the night, essentially, on the US map. We've got 161 delegates up for grabs here. And of course, not surprisingly, we're starting to see more and more counties going red. And if you take a look at the areas, urban areas, where you might think that Nikki Haley would have stood a bit more of a fighting chance, somewhere like Dallas, for example, she hasn't been able to breach that 30% mark just yet. Let's just skip over then and see where we are with Alabama and see whether that IVF recent controversy has been bearing out. Donald Trump still managing to take 87% to Nikki Haley's 8%, and she had been less clear with regards to what she would want to see done with IVF services. So just a snapshot at this early stage as more results continue to come in.
Helena, thanks for that. Catty, you've just been looking at a few of the results there. What's your kind of view of what you've been seeing?
Well, there's an awful lot of red and not very much blue for Nikki Haley. She would have needed, obviously, to have done better if she was going to have a hope of picking up delegates. But it's interesting that she's not going to talk tonight. She's down in South Carolina. She's in Charleston. We haven't really kind of talked about Haley and what she's going to be doing. And there are no plans for her, we understand, to address reporters tonight, which suggests to me that tonight, at least, she's not planning to get out of the race. Now, she may do so over the next coming days. And then the question will be, does she endorse Donald Trump? Does she not endorse Donald Trump? Where does that leave her supporters? If she doesn't endorse Donald Trump, is there more likelihood that more of her supporters come November will feel that they don't want to vote for Donald Trump? I think it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens to her supporters over the next few weeks.
And as you say, she's clearly going to take tonight to, it would look anyway, think about what she's doing. We'll talk more about that in the next hour. We will leave it there for the moment. Catty Kay, Rodney Davis and Stephanie Murphy, thanks for joining us. And do stay with us here on BBC News. We'll be back in just a moment.
Hello there. We could see more sunshine around for Wednesday than what we had on Tuesday, particularly across eastern areas. So I think a brighter afternoon to come, but there will be some scattered showers around, especially across England and Wales. And winds will generally stay quite light. We'll have high pressure anchored over Scandinavia, low pressure out in the Atlantic, trying to push this weather front ever closer towards our shores. But it could reach the West Country as we move through the latter part of this morning. Elsewhere, we're starting off with a lot of cloud across the east of the country. That will tend to melt away, though it stays cloudy for eastern Scotland, northeast England. Some sunshine for East Anglia in the southeast. A few showers into the afternoon, East Wales and the Midlands. And temperature-wise, up to around 10, 11 degrees, single digits along North Sea coast where we have the cloud and the breeze. Now, as we head through Wednesday night, it looks like it stays dry for many. The showers fade away. Start to see some cloud rolling into central and eastern areas. So where we have the cloud, more of a breeze, and temperatures 2 to 5 degrees under clearer skies further north and west. Then there could be a touch of frost. For Thursday then, we have low pressure anchored out towards the west, the southwest, that area of high pressure over Scandinavia, just edging a bit further westward, so influencing our weather more. Could start seeing east-southeasterly wind picking up further though, so quite a breezy day to come. Plenty of sunshine around away from the east coast, and there will be some afternoon showers again, particularly England and Wales. Probably the best of the sunshine, western Scotland into Northern Ireland, western Wales. Top temperatures again, 11, maybe 12 degrees. Into Friday, you see more isobars on the charts. It's going to be windier, a strong east-southeasterly wind. That'll take the edge off the temperatures, pushing some cloud to northern and eastern areas, particularly the northern half of the country. England and Wales could, at this stage, see quite a bit of sunshine, but there'll always be showers loitering close to the southwest. And a windy day to come for all. Gusty winds, particularly windy across the south and the east, thanks to that southeasterly wind. So chillier along eastern coastal areas, up to around 11 or 12 further west. Into the weekend, low pressure loiters to the southwest of the country, trying to push its way northward. So we'll introduce further showers or even longer spells of rain to southern and western areas. We could start to see a few showers developing further north and east as well. It will remain quite windy with our wind coming in from the east or the southeast. That's it from me. Take care.
The art of good conversation is to say the right thing at the right time and in the right way. You have to be original, sympathetic, encouraging, and also keep an open mind. And you really do just need to sit back and listen.
Catty Kay chats with prominent names from the worlds of business, science, and culture.
Influential with me, Catty Kay. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
The world of film is changing faster and faster all the time. Our global Talking Movies team brings you up to date on the latest in movie making from around the world.
Stories from other cultures.
Interviewing top filmmakers and stars.
I didn't think I'd ever seen anything like that on screen.
From blockbusters to art house cinema, we'll spotlight the brilliant and unique voices bringing their stories to the big screen.
Talking Movies. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Live from Washington, welcome to BBC News. President Biden and former President Donald Trump are racking up primary wins on another busy election night in the US. Voters across more than a dozen states cast ballots this Super Tuesday. We're bringing you the latest results as they come in. Hello, I'm Caitrionna Perry, live in Washington. You're very welcome to this BBC News special coverage of Super Tuesday. It's a big night for frontrunners Joe Biden and Donald Trump as they continue to lock in wins in order to secure the Democratic and Republican presidential nominations. And we have a major announcement to start off this hour. Our partners at CBS News project that former President Donald Trump will win the Republican primary in the state of Texas. Let's look now at where things stand at this hour with that win from Donald Trump. That means he's now claimed victory in Virginia, North Carolina and Oklahoma. They were the first states to report for Donald Trump, followed by Tennessee, Maine and now Texas as well. While President Joe Biden has also won in those 6, plus Vermont and Massachusetts. Voting continues in California, Utah and in Alaska. Super Tuesday is also a crucial moment for the former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, for her campaign, which is hoping to slow down Donald Trump's momentum as the Republican frontrunner. Tuesday's contest is the US presidential primary's largest prize, with more than 1/3 of the total delegates available, and they're expected to be awarded for both Republicans and Democrats tonight. We can also now report that our partners at CBS News project that President Biden will win the Democratic primary in the state of Arkansas. And to round that out, in Arkansas, CBS News also projects that former President Donald Trump will win the Republican primary in the state of Arkansas. Well, the polls have just closed this hour in 3 states, in Minnesota, in Texas and Colorado. And we can cross live now to our correspondent, Emma Vardy, who is in Denver in Colorado. Emma, any indication of who might win there in Colorado?
I don't think there's going to be any huge surprises here, just as the other states' results are coming in, showing wins for Donald Trump as expected and wins for Joe Biden. Colorado's highly likely to be the same kind of picture. The question for voters here really is how many people decided to tick that box in the Democratic contest for the non-committed option. This was one of the states here that allowed a non-committed option on the ballot for Democrats as a protest vote against Joe Biden. So really the question here for people is how many votes is that option able to pick up? Because of course that is an unwanted headline for Joe Biden at a time when he's hoping for a really solid front in the Democratic Party to go on to challenge Donald Trump in November.
And Emma, any of those uncommitted voters, I mean, is there a suggestion that they wouldn't ultimately vote for him in the general election, that it's just a protest at this point in time?
Yeah, sorry about the earpiece trouble there. That's a good question. I was asking that myself to Democrats today, saying, well, look, if you go for this protest vote, doesn't that just harm Democrat chances overall when come November? And they were saying to me, look, we want to try to push the party to say, look, there could be an alternative to Joe Biden. We're worried about his age. We don't think he's the best candidate to challenge Trump. And this is our way of showing that protest, as well as showing dissatisfaction with the way that Joe Biden has handled the Israel-Gaza war. But they will then admit to you, well, yes, when it comes to the general election, they're going to vote Democrat because, of course, they much prefer that to the alternative of voting for Donald Trump and a Republicans party. So, yes, is it a bit of an anomaly which might go away further down the line? Perhaps. But at the moment, it is showing that there is a weakness for Joe Biden. And overall, what it's showing, particularly for young voters, is that if Joe Biden has a problem with young voters at this stage of the race, whether it's because of how their feelings about his approach to the Israel-Gaza war, or whether it's because they're worried about his age, well, that could make a difference come the general election, because it's things like young voters or female voters. They could be the ones who are the real swing voters who could just make the difference in the middle, because so many states in the US, of course, are pretty much foregone conclusions. They're going to vote blue, Democrat, or they're going to vote Republican. It's all about the ones in the middle. And if you're getting low turnout, low enthusiasm from perhaps young voters or others, that could give Donald Trump the edge, and that's something Joe Biden will not want to see, even though, of course, tonight, a non-committed ballot is not going to threaten his overall chances in becoming the Democratic nominee.
OK, Emma in Denver, Colorado, thanks for that. We'll chat to you later in the night. Well, our reporter Helena Humphrey is pouring through the latest Super Tuesday results with the closing of the latest polls. She's at our touchscreen. Let's go over to her now. Helena.
Hi there, Caitrionna. Just to update you then on what we're seeing in terms of delegates, 480 for Donald Trump right now, 46 for Nikki Haley. Just in terms of analysing some of those results that we saw coming in earlier, remember Vermont really was something that the Haley campaign had pinned their hopes on in terms of being able to pick up any delegates. And what you'll see, I think, is some quite interesting results because, yes, in places like Chittenden, where you'll find Burlington, although just 57% of the results counted, 8 out of 34 precincts, Haley is in front, not by a considerable margin for an area that is liberal. You know, this is a state that has been blue since Clinton, essentially. And if you just move down somewhere like Windham, where the Haley campaign really would have been thinking perhaps they could pick up some delegates here with an open primary, not all of the results told yet, but actually Donald Trump out in front still with 10 precincts to go. So that is something of an interesting result there. Taking a look at California, just to remind people that this is the big prize tonight, isn't it? It's 169 delegates that are up for grabs. And of course, California, be it liberal, the problem here is it's a closed primary, so you will only have Republican voters coming out. So not much hope there for Nikki Haley, particularly when it's winner take all. Alabama is an interesting one, not so much in terms of what we know the state does, getting behind Donald Trump, pretty much a foregone conclusion there. Currently we're seeing 84% with just 2 precincts counted, but more what's the impact in relation to recent news events. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, Alabama's state Supreme Court ruling that frozen embryos created through IVF should be considered children. We know that for both Donald Trump and the Haley campaign, they had to come out quickly and clarify their position on that. And it was Donald Trump who came out swiftly after, saying that lawmakers should make sure that access to that treatment is protected. And right now we can see early stage, but he is still in front. Just one I wanted to draw people's attention to in terms of where we're going to start to test the strength of Donald Trump is Utah, because yes, it is conservative, but in terms of what you'll see in this particular population where you've got Mormon voters, for example, it's going to be really interesting to look at somewhere like Salt Lake and see when we know that 51% of Mormons in a recent poll have said they consider Donald Trump to be blasphemous. Will that bear out in the polls, or will we see him start to gain some traction? So just some more results coming in and some updates as we continue to get those results through the course of the evening. Caitrionna.
Thanks, Helena. Well, we mentioned at the top of the hour that Donald Trump is projected to win the state of Texas, and we can now report that our partners at CBS News project that President Biden will win the Democratic primary in the state of Texas. Texas and California, of course, two of the biggest prizes on offer tonight, with large delegate counts and major significance in November's general election. Both states, of course, also share a border with Mexico, and voters have been consistently ranking immigration near the top of their issues of concern. President Biden and former President Trump visited the border last week. Each blamed the other for the record numbers of migrant crossings seen recently. In California, border crossings were up 60% last month, even as overall numbers of migrants entering the US dropped. Sumi Somaskanda has this report now from a border crossing near San Diego.
Muy buenos días. Welcome. Thank you.
It's just before dawn at San Isidro.
Group of people out here to try to help. Yo me llamo Adriana.
Just another day at the southern border.
We're only going to have one line. So women and children first.
A group of migrants has gathered on the strip of land between Mexico and the U.S.
Thank you so much. God bless America. Thank you.
Adriana Yasso with the NGO American Friends Service Committee is delivering rain gear and food, a vital lifeline for those who need it. Olga says she left behind a hard life in Ecuador and a difficult journey. She tells us there were good and bad people along the way. Every day, the border opens for these migrants from Africa, Asia, and South America, fleeing violence or economic hardship. This crossing south of San Diego has become a new focal point in the surge of migrants crossing into the U.S. The first step in a new journey for these migrants. They board buses to a processing center. The number of people crossing south of San Diego is up 73% on last year, a number that is overwhelming everyone.
I would say our county is overwhelmed and it is impacted.
San Diego County Board Supervisor Nora Vargas says her county had a solution, short-term facilities that provided basic necessities, but then funding ran out. So she wrote a letter to President Biden asking for help.
And that is what I want to make sure that the Biden administration and Congress understands, that we can get past the politics and really talk about the global humanitarian crisis for what it is. People who are fleeing persecution, who have a legal right to come to the United States, and they should be treated with dignity and with respect.
Did you get an answer from the White House?
Not yet.
President Biden traveled to the border in Texas last week. So did former President Trump. He blamed Biden for the immigration crisis.
Now the United States is being overrun by the Biden migrant crime. It's a new form of vicious violation to our country.
Biden called on Congress to pass bipartisan legislation.
It's time for the speakers and some of my Republican friends in Congress who are blocking this bill to show a little spine.
The president has the capability to secure the border. He doesn't need a piece of paper or a bill from Congress to do that.
Jim Desmond is also a San Diego County supervisor.
Someplace else?
He went with his team to see where migrants are being dropped off in the city.
This gentleman's asking me where he is.
And he is calling on the White House to take action now.
We need to enforce our current laws by securing the border and stopping the border.
The challenges facing San Diego are laid bare here. Bus after bus arrive at this transit center. Around 600 migrants a day are dropped off after processing and left on their own. The vast majority are traveling onwards to cities across the U.S. Migrants from all over the world continue to arrive, and this is just one of hundreds of border crossings. It is aid agencies taking action where they say lawmakers have not.
This is the most powerful country in the history of humanity. To not be able to provide a little bit of dignity and humanity to these people is irresponsible, it's inhumane, and it's undignified.
Solutions won't come here at the border. They have to come from Washington. But both sides seem miles apart.
Well, let's talk some more about this now. I'm joined live by Patrick Svitek, a politics breaking news reporter for The Washington Post, who's covered previous elections, and he joins us now from San Antonio in Texas. Patrick, thanks for being with us. You might talk to us a little bit for our viewers around the world about just what life is like for those living along the border who constantly cite immigration as one of the issues of concern for them.
Well, look, I think for border communities in Texas, there are sometimes conflicted feelings. I do think that they view there being legitimate issues related to state and federal policy on the border, but they also get a little exhausted from politicians, constantly traveling there and using their communities, as they would say, a photo op. And so I think there is a recognition that there are legitimate concerns when it comes to security, law enforcement, and caring for migrants at the local level in these towns. But also you occasionally do hear frustrations about the issue just becoming so politicized.
And on that note, Patrick, we heard in Sumi's report there a call for this to go past the politics. Is that actually possible, do you think, in an election year?
I think it's very hard, and we just saw that in the United States Congress recently, where there was at least the outline of a bipartisan border security deal in the Senate, but it fell apart, partly because the former president, Donald Trump, suggested that it would have politically helped the current president that he's running against, Joe Biden, to pass this bill. So, of course, politics in an election year always makes this issue even more harder than it would be otherwise.
And that view is unlikely to change, really, of course, the rest of this year.
Of course, yeah, that sentiment, I think, is only likely to intensify as we get into the general presidential election in Texas, and you have Trump and Biden, more directly squaring off than they have been recently. They're both still technically going through the nominating process inside their parties. They don't face much opposition, but we haven't even arrived at the direct one-to-one matchup yet.
And we hear repeatedly when, again, on Capitol Hill in Congress, when there are efforts to pass a bill for aid for Ukraine, aid for Israel, humanitarian aid for Gaza, that people say the greater national security threat that they fear is on the southern border. Explain to us that logic.
Sure. I mean, there is this increasing ideology within the Republican Party, especially since Donald Trump has come to power, that the United States should focus more on domestic issues versus involving itself in international conflicts. And I think on these, especially on the Ukraine aid issue, you've really seen that strain inside the Republican Party show itself, and Trump has really presided over that shift within the party. I would say it still feels like that is somewhat of a minority position within the party, but at least when it comes to the rhetoric and the politics of it, it is getting louder.
And people, voters in states who are hundreds and hundreds of miles from the border still register immigration as one of their number one issues of concern. Why do they say that?
I think there are a few issues for that. Republicans would say that every state has become a border state and is seeing the impacts of the border policies under the current president. You've had efforts by the Republican governor of Texas, for example, to bus migrants to different Democratic-led cities around the country. And those Democratic-led cities have struggled to care for the migrants that are arriving there. And so I think you do have an increased national awareness of this problem. Some of it is obviously due to the almost political gamesmanship that I just described, but it is becoming more of a national awareness. And I think that's showing up in the polls that you referenced.
So what do you see happening from here out, Patrick, on this issue?
Well, not much, unfortunately. If you're someone who wants policy progress on this, as we just mentioned, we're heading into the heat of an election year. Already, we've seen progress on this issue stymied in Congress, and so this is going to be an issue that there's not going to be much policy progress on in the election year.
Okay, well, thanks for bringing us up to speed with all of that. That's Patrick Svitek of The Washington Post talking to us from San Antonio in Texas. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, we have 2 more projections coming in for you now. Our partners at CBS News project that President Biden will win the Democratic primary in the state of Alabama. And once again, it's the same on the other side. CBS News projecting that former President Donald Trump will win the Republican primary in the state of Alabama. Well, I'm joined here still by Rodney Davis, former Congressman for Illinois, and Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic Congresswoman for Florida. All night long, we've been saying Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. No mention of Nikki Haley. Is this her last bit of the road, Rodney?
I think it has to be. She might have raised some money after being able to find some small victories in the last few primaries. I don't know where she gets the resources here on out. Remember, Helena laid out what a good night for Nikki Haley would be, which would be 1/5 of what was expected of Donald Trump, and that would be 200 delegates. She is nowhere near that 200 delegate count being attained tonight.
What do you think, Stephanie? It's expensive running races like this, isn't it?
It is expensive, and I think it says a lot that her campaign hasn't placed any ads, and we have primaries that are coming up in the next couple of weeks, 2 more here just in March, and they haven't placed any ads, bought any ads in those key states. So it's an interesting perspective. And I actually think this might be the moment where the old school, the traditional Republican realizes that their party isn't the Reagan Republican Party that they have anymore. I think for a number of years, they fought really hard to try to take the party back from what Trump had made it. But I think in this primary where you're seeing it's 60-30, or 70-30, 60-40, that maybe the party is what the former president has made it, and that's what it is. And all of these people who had been supporting Haley were holding on to the hope that they could reclaim the Republican Party as it once was. And maybe this is the moment they realize that that's a hope that is too far out of reach.
What do you think, Rodney?
Parties ebb and flow, countries, and where we are today in our polarized environment is nothing new in our nation's history, but it's new to us. It's something we're not used to. Look, obviously there were a lot of people that thought I wasn't reflective of today's Republican Party. I'm much more of the Reagan-esque type. Let's invest in stopping Vladimir Putin before American soldiers have to stop him in other NATO countries. But at the same time, Joe Biden and the Democrats are not taking into consideration what I think are going to be some inflection points coming up as we move into the summertime. I'm very concerned about our national conventions and the protests that I believe will come from the pro-Hamas protesters. And that scares me, and it could change the reflection of many of these Republicans Stephanie talked about, especially when it's a binary choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the conventions, because I think we should talk about that. And firstly, I don't think they're pro-Hamas protesters. I think they're pro-Palestine and the suffering and the people of Gaza.
Without you disagreeing with what I say.
I'm not disagreeing with you. It's my job to keep everyone in their right lanes, not get me in trouble, not get everyone in trouble. That's
to
my
be
job.
honest, political violence, the seeds of political violence exist across the political spectrum in America. And in fact, the Republicans who dared to vote for somebody other than the Trump's backed person in the speaker's race faced Republican blowback to the point where there were death threats to their wives and their families and themselves. So this violence exists across the spectrum, and it's as much Republican on Republican as it is, red team, blue team.
But Rodney, just talking about the Republican convention for one moment. Nikki Haley will have some delegates. She hasn't dropped out of the race yet. She said maybe she won't. She said she'll take till tonight, see how it goes, kind of make a decision then. What happens at the convention to her delegates? Or, is there any mathematical equation or any likelihood if Donald Trump's hit by a meteor or something that she could get the nomination?
Okay, that's a hypothetical I'll take this time. If Donald Trump is
force majeure kind of,
we're all in trouble.
If Donald Trump is hit by a meteor, would Nikki Haley have a chance? Yes. However, I would say even a slim chance. It's not a given that the second place runner-up, if that hypothetical came true and a meteor struck down Donald Trump in his front-runner status, that she would be the one who would get Donald Trump's delegates. It would be an open game, and I think you would see others step up to the plate. But let's be realistic here. It's going to be a Donald Trump, Joe Biden race. Donald Trump is going to roll through this convention. If Nikki Haley comes through with a few hundred delegates on a convention floor, those few hundred delegates they might scream and yell and make a protest, but they're more establishment Republicans. They're a lot less likely to scream and yell.
And so the question becomes, does she translate the votes into policy changes?
Exactly, and we'll come back to talk about what happens next in just a moment, but we do have to check in now with Helena over at our special watching wall because she has some information for us there. We've had a lot of states called already. Voting, of course, still open for business in California and Utah. And Helena, what have you got for us now?
Still open for business indeed. I want to show you, Caitrionna, some of the key areas to be watching as the night continues. Let's start with Utah then. I think it's always a really interesting state to look at because, yes, you might think, okay, conservative, but what brand are we talking essentially here? Will Donald Trump manage to gain ground with Mormon voters, for example, or will we still hear calls against him from Mitt Romney and the likes resonating? And, if you take a look at, we haven't got the results in yet, but somewhere like Salt Lake, where you do have a Mormon population of considerable size, 51% of Mormons in that area saying that they consider Donald Trump to be blasphemous. Will that bear out, or will Donald Trump manage to gain some ground? Of course, the big prize of the night, the big show will be later, won't it, with California, because you've got 169 delegates up for grabs, the biggest delegate count of the night. You can think, okay, liberal, deep blue state. Could this be good for Nikki Haley? No, that's a misnomer for a couple of reasons. Closed primary. Okay, so Republican voters coming out. We're not going to be seeing that independent vote, that moderate vote that Nikki Haley has been relying on. So perhaps, she might do well in areas like the Bay Area, San Francisco, for example, but when you move into somewhere like Sacramento, the state capital, that has traditionally been the bellwether. And just to remind you of the result that we saw in 2016 in the Republican primary, Donald Trump coming out in front of Kasich and Cruz. So just a few things to be keeping your eye on throughout the course of the night. Caitrionna.
Helena, we're just going to go in a moment, but before we go, I'll tell you we've got some projections coming to us from Colorado. Donald Trump and Joe Biden both projected to win there in Colorado. That projection coming to us from CBS News. Do stay with us here on BBC News. You can find, as always, the latest details and analysis on our live page. And of course, right here on the BBC News channel, where we are bringing you all the news as we get it from, of course, this big night in US politics, Super Tuesday, and all the other important news from around the world as well. Do stay with us here on BBC News. Take care.